thought this is about the clearest collection of paragraphs we've seen.
Yes.
You know, this has, well,
yeah,
you teach.
It's fantastic because now he's pulled together the previous three sections, A, B, and C. We've you know, and just to, you know, remind ourselves, he starts describing in section A, you know, what is the perspective, what is the worldview of ancient civilization. He starts with the focus on physis, on nature as becoming, and nature as the authoritative source of truth that overrides dogma, that overrides tradition, but that also overrides logic and math and any other schema for deciding what's real. Nature overrides all of it.
Oh, hang on. I've been told by the rationalist humanist atheists that reason
yes,
is the highest and greatest tool that we have.
That's how you know they're
I'm just
modern.
trying to figure out, you know, how a baby makes its way to its mother's teat.
Yes.
It attended the latest committee meeting to figure that out. Okay.
Yes, that's how it did it. It reasoned it out. The baby went to went to the baby council, and together they voted on where they thought mom's teat was, and that's how they decided. They logicked it out, and they had an election. Yeah, it's how you know that the people you're talking to are moderns, because, you know, an ancient never would have said that. An ancient would have said, you know, reason, as important as it is at the bottom of the three sources of authority. First nature, then the gods, and then reason. So, you know, it's one of those things where we like to think that because we're reality-based, we must do things based on nature too. We must think that science tells us what is naturally true, and that ergo, we might even be more driven by nature, you know, than the ancients, where we, you know, we like to think of ourselves as the best. So somebody starts saying that the ancients were more centered in nature than we are. We get our fists up. We're like, oh yeah, you know, we want to prove that they're not and that we're the best. But the truth is, if we thought that nature was the dominant source of truth, we wouldn't organize anything the way we do it. Everything that we organize is based on human decision making. You know, the politics, the economics, even the choice of which religion do we want to attend on Sunday. It's all based on human preferences, which makes it clear that we've put humanity at the top of the sources of truth. And
I might say that it seems to me the very people that call themselves environmentalists seem to be engaged in common with the practice really excluding nature. Modern thought, it's become exclusive of nature. It just looks at our wants, our wishes as a particular species, and that's it. That's the highest there is. There's nothing else.
Mm-hmm. To serve man, right? I mean, which of course is hilarious if you've seen the old Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah.
But even if you haven't, the fact that to serve man is somehow the subtitle of everything we ever do or talk about. Me, I. Anyway, so he starts with that, section A. He starts with that. He says, this is the foundation. Can't understand the ancients at all unless you know that they put nature above the gods and nature and the gods above man as sources of truth and authority. And that the phrase, which I say almost every day, it comes up in some context, kata fuse, according to nature, is the end of the discussion. It's the highest source. It's, you know, you've seen the memes that say your argument, here is a cat riding a bicycle, your argument is irrelevant. Have you seen any of those variations of memes on the internet? There's always some strange, bizarre thing that like makes you rock back on your heels and go, what am I looking at? And they say, your argument is irrelevant. And Aristotle is basically saying, kata fuse, you know, if you're not paying attention to what is true according to nature, then your argument is irrelevant. As Aristotle says, no word is kata fuse. You can't use human language or human declarations as an overriding source of truth. Nature wins. So he starts with that in section A. In section B, he then says, now what does that mean about human character, human culture? You know, the relationship between custom and nature, the relationship between aristocracy and philosophy. He says, if we take seriously that perspective of nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth, then it changes our understanding of what human nature might even be, or what the nature of a culture or a period of history might be. It changes our understanding of how you decide what your government or economy ought to be. It would have to be done very differently than the way that we do it. It goes directly into psychology, sociology, and politics, in other words, rather than treating them as these separate realms and never the two shall cross in our nice, tidy Noetic divisions of things into categories. The ancients said, oh, no, all those things are subject to nature, and therefore they're all subject to discussion about whether our statements about politics or economics or psychology are true or not. It's all got to be subjected to that discussion. And of course, the conclusion that they reach is what we see when we look in nature is not equality in the sense of identicality. If we are to treat people well, we can't do it on the basis of us all being clones of each other. There is an enormous diversity in nature. There's a diversity of talents, of capabilities, and that how we structure society has to deal with that truth, that reality. And when we look at human governments and human economies and so on, we typically find that they don't. They come out one way or another. They come out with their recipe for how they're going to do these things, and they really don't want to hear about what you see in nature. All right, the next section, form and matter, organicism, arete. Here we talked about this idea of to what extent does anything perceive the world around it and perceive itself and manage itself to adapt effectively to the world around it. The difference between a stone and an amoeba, right? The stone has coherence, but it lacks awareness. It doesn't know about the world around it. If it changes in response to the world around it, it is entirely in a passive way. The world is inflicting itself upon the stone, and eventually the stone cracks or erodes or what have you, in a passive relationship. But to be alive is to have a relationship of awareness in which you perceive the world around you, and the better you perceive it, the better you understand it, the more you can then change yourself to adapt yourself better to that world. And that this is an issue of form and matter, right? So the stone is mostly matter with very little form. It's not able to conceive of itself or the world, let alone impose its conception upon itself or the world. It's mostly just there to be acted upon. But a living organism like an amoeba, despite not having a single neuron, an amoeba is sensing itself and it's sensing its environment. And because of those things, it's able to respond to the world actively. It's able to say, there's less food to my right, but there's more food to my left. I shall go to my left. While the stone just sits there oblivious to food and movement and all these other things. So form and matter, what makes the amoeba alive, what makes it proficient, is its capacity to develop what the ancients thought of as form, a model for the world. What does it want? What is the world like? What is it like? And to relate that model to the world in order to change the matter of itself and of its surroundings to comply with that form. You see what I mean? There's willfulness, what we talked about as noesis, is a critical component, right? To not just accept things as they are, although you have to be able to do that or you have no awareness, but also to then be able to come up with a better idea, even if you don't have a brain, even if you're just an amoeba, of how you would like things to be, and then to create changes that impose that form, that model of the world upon the matter of the world. And to the ancients, this issue of the organic relationship between form and matter, the responsibility to govern oneself, autonomia, autarkia, is critical to distinguishing among people. If you look at people, you know, what race they are, or what class they are, or what religion they are, or what language they speak, yeah, these are all traditional divisions we use to divide each other up and try to organize society. But to be truer to the ancient worldview, you would have to treat those kinds of distinctions as less important than the distinction about who has managed to develop autarkia and autonomia, who is willing to sacrifice their short-term desires in order to create better long-term consequences, who is a slave of their passions and who is not, who is a slave of their ideas and ideologies and who is not, who can manage this complicated relationship effectively between yourself and the larger world in order to, you know, be a force for good in the world, in order to do whatever it is that we, perhaps more evolved, although this is a terrible turn of phrase, very 19th century, my apologies, perhaps in some ways, you know, more complicated and more sophisticated than an amoeba. Nevertheless, we have the same fundamental problem an amoeba has, which is of using our begriff to figure out what the hell is going on around us and inside of us, using our noesis to develop, you know, a sense of how we wish things would be rather than how they are, preferably in some way that aligns with the forces of the world, and then to modify ourselves and the world to make things better. Geneva asks, is Smith arguing that we should resort to thinking the same as the ancients or just the way we currently think? Neither. What all he's doing in this book is saying, as moderns, we swim in the modernist epoch and modernist cultures to such an extent that to us, it's the water. Like you ask any fish about water and they can't tell you because it's all they've ever known. It's invisible to them. If you want to learn about water, you can't ask a fish. You have to ask somebody like an amphibian who moves back and forth across the boundary and goes, whoa, did you know there's not water as well as water? And by studying water and not water, we can figure out what water is and start to understand it better. Smith is saying we can't understand modernity, and thus we can't understand ourselves unless we can learn to understand some other epochs that are different from our own. So he's starting out with the ancient one, and this is where we've been focusing. When we finish the ancient section, chapter 4, we'll move on to a series of chapters that's about the medieval epoch. And that'll take some doing to work it out. But again, he's going to try to get us to understand that one. And then once we've understood both of those, the final section of the book is going to be a bunch of chapters about modernity. Saying, now, in light of what we learned about the ancients and how they saw the world, and what we learned about the medievals and how they saw the world, what does that tell us about the peculiarities of the way we see the world? What is it we've taken for granted all our lives and never really asked ourselves enough about? But now that we're armed with these other epochs, we can compare them and go, whoa, you mean people didn't always think this way? You mean this is a choice I could choose differently? It's to free us. This is the purpose of the book. And I think he would argue, and Donald can tell me if I'm wrong, that each of these epochs has its own character, its own distinctive combination of things that it's good at and things that it's bad at, things that it understands better than other epochs and things that it understands worse than other epochs. They're tied together by the character of the epoch, right? What we bring into focus to our finite mortal minds comes at the cost of the background we suppress out of focus. And so there's, to be good at one thing, we're always being less good at other things that are blurring behind us so that we don't see them as clearly. So by comparing these different epochs, Donald says never, he would never say that. So as a result, what that means is we can learn from each of these epochs and say, what were they better at than we are? And also what are we better at than they were? Which comes naturally to moderns, but I mean, maybe accurately instead of merely ego-aggrandizingly like moderns usually do, we could triangulate and say, well, what would another possible epoch look like that's different from all three of them, but maybe pulls the strings together? We can learn and create some choice for ourselves. I think that's where he's going with this. That's the point of this. So before I dive into the text of section D, arete or natural excellence, which pulls together these previous three sections and uses them as the foundation to build a new layer of the ancient worldview and explain it to us, I'm going to call on Phil, who patiently has had his hand up. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah. I'm going to say, first of all, I guess I'm going to say that I'm admiring Hegel more and more, not because he got it right, actually. I think there's some things he got wrong, but the fact that he is moving in a direction of unfolding the history of thinking and the history of the development of Geist. So that, I'll say, and that part, I really admire him for putting it in sort of a cumulative, comprehensive order that you could think through. The second thing I want to say is that it's what I was talking about the Hebrew Bible, Genesis and Hebrew Bible, and Genesis in the New Testament. And I focus on God created everything, and there was much more of a physical relationship with the world. And in the New Testament, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, which is interesting, was with God. And so I thought about that, and the Word was God, okay? So the Word, I guess you could say, in that sense, is its transformation, is that the Word, or logos, or you could maybe dumb it down to say logic was with God. So God had logic. But the next transformation is logic was God. Okay. All right, which is sort of like, okay, with a God. And I was thinking about that, how that began to make sense in the Trinity. In this sense, there was Yahweh and there was Christ. So Christ was part of God. That's the 3 in 1. And then there was the Holy Spirit. I now translate that in what I've kind of always kind of believed. The Holy Spirit was the human spirit. The spirit was the thing that migrate between the two and unified it in this sense. Okay, so we're already moving to a point where certainly God, or the ultimate bearer of truth, was some kind of logic, okay? Some kind of logic, all right? And that makes sense. And then I thought about Homer, interestingly enough. I kind of had a discussion about the Iliad. And the moment I focused on was when Achilles was killed because the arrow in his heel. Because Achilles was the noblest of all warriors, according to the Iliad. There's no question about that. But the second noblest was Ajax. Okay. And of course, Ajax should get the armor and get the honor of wearing Achilles' armor because he should be the next in line. And Ajax was enraged by the fact that the armor was given to Odysseus. And I'm thinking about this, and that's interesting, because that was already the beginning, in a funny way, the pre-beginning of modernity. Because it sort of said that, with Ajax, there was a kind of thinking, but it was very elemental, that's on the surface, the immediacy. In fact, you're not quite sure where it's located. Maybe it's in his body and his arms, and there was immediate response. And that was enraged to such a degree that Athena had to intervene and put him in a trance. And so he ended up, instead of killing all his comrades, because he was so enraged, he ended up killing a bunch of oxen, right? Because he knew that that's gone off the cliff. And that somehow Odysseus was awarded because he was more thoughtful. He was able to manage his thinking with a degree of managerial thought that could compartmentalize and coordinate various bunches of feelings and thinking
Yes.
and so forth
Yes.
to, in a sense, maneuver between the things. Okay.
Yes.
And so I'm thinking, oh, in poetic form, Homer had already suggested Plato's form in the concrete. Interesting. Like,
Yeah.
we would have thought that Plato started it, or maybe Parmenides. Then I thought about, the thing about what this could teach us is that modernity is perhaps not wrong. Actually, I'm committed as a modernist because I'm committed to the executive function of thinking. Okay. But nonetheless, it might be wrong because it's one-sided. Because there's a continuum between the body and the executive function.
Yes.
And the funny thing is, the body is more in direct contact with the world than the mind, because the mind could only deal with the appearances, how it appears in the world.
Right.
Okay. So it's one-sided because it's dealing with appearances. And recently in the Hegel group, there was an interesting discussion. This guy started out with the 3 Nobel Prize winners in physics. They were given the reward that related to the quantum entanglement, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And several other quantum physicists in the past, including Niels Bohr, has been given the Nobel Prize. And they thought, perhaps we have reached the limits of analytical thinking, that we have confronted that something that seems to be true, but we don't actually understand it. But we
Right.
do not understand it.
Right.
And that's perhaps where the problem is. And now it's been authenticated in the latest thing that the committee actually believe that is the case, that there might be a limit. You could say transcendental limit if you believe in God, or transcendental in the sense that there is actually perhaps a limit to understanding, at least as of yet. Maybe you could say, okay, 50, 100 years from now, we will understand actually what quantum entanglement really is. But we don't understand it now. But it does seem to work. It seems to work. Okay. And so then I go back to Heraclitus and I say, quite often people think of Heraclitus as sort of like coming from the earth and expressing the ever-changing things of the earth. And I think that might be true, but I actually think of Heraclitus as coming through the middle, right? Not from Dionysus or to Apollo,
Right.
but to Artemis,
Right.
right?
Right.
But somewhere in between, and quite often, when I'm thinking, when you work in the world ordinarily, you come through thinking to the middle, and then if you need to, you go down to the lower fundamental parts, or you go up to more abstract, formal relationships. So when you go, could you hand me that chair? The other person already understand enough to interpolate And they might say, you mean this chair? You don't begin by saying, oh, give me that chair that is black and white and it's sort of like got the rungs on the chair. Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
If the guy says, I don't understand which chair you mean, then you go a little bit further.
The finger that points.
That's right. And then you go a little bit further, you know, or if you want to be abstract, you know, you don't begin certainly from the top by saying, oh, give me that thing over there that's sort of like meant for seating.
It occupies space and has a certain mass.
That's right. And
Right.
so you begin you enter language and transmission information from the middle,
Yes.
which allows you to go down or up.
Yes.
And that's what I think that's what you were pointing out. What was it, to the slime mo, right? You need to go down because they actually live in the body. I don't think that the slimo have these higher manner. You know, I don't think they have Odysseus's mind.
No.
But they seem somehow to respond to the world, right?
That's right. That's
And
right.
so in some way, we miss a lot of that stuff because we only now just begin to think, you know, when you go down, oh, there are ecological things we completely missed, right? Because, oh, we don't need to bother with those plants and animals because they're dumb, right? And so you miss that, and you miss the other end with this quantum physics. So you're cut off. And so I think there's something about the middle, and I don't mean the middle in the sense of moderate, you know.
I know what you mean.
You know, so
Yeah.
in some sense, I think you move through the middle, and you could then move up or down, you know, as necessary in terms of what thinking is about.
Yeah.
I think that's a part that Hegel missed. That's a part that Hegel missed. And so I just want to go through my complex thought about in the beginning was the Word.
Thank you, Phil.
God, and the Word was God. Okay, so
I appreciate
that
it.
should give you as a reasonable entry into the fact that in some ways it's opening up this thing about a kind of Geist and how you should move in through the middle and go in both directions. That's similar to what I'm saying about living in the borderlands.
Yeah.
But in this way, it's sort of a more
Yeah.
sort of an entry way of getting into it.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I mean, this is the issue that we're building up here, section by section in chapter 4, is this idea that it is not sufficient to try to be entirely matter, right? The life of a stone is no life for a human being. It's also not sufficient to try to be entirely will. You know, the life of, you know, the orthodox medieval God, the one who's all will and precedes matter, is outside the capabilities of human beings. We can't live either of those kinds of life. We have sort of a middle way in which we must be partly passive and partly active. And it's not just some simple, like you say, balance in the middle. It's something more complicated. The middle way is more complex than that. There is some kind of a dance of mediation, you know, as we shift around through the world between when do we be passive and when do we be active, and most of the time some mix of both.
Well, let me interject. Remember what I said a couple of weeks ago, a couple other meetings ago, about Theodore Roosevelt, the man in the arena. That really speaks to that.
Yes, it really does. That's right. Yeah, and people's, you know, comments, dismissive comments about armchair quarterbacking, you know, are related to that. The idea that, you know, what makes sense to someone sitting in their living room watching a game is totally different from what makes sense to someone on the field. When a giant guy's charging down on you and you've got the football, you know, you don't have the luxury of going, let me think theoretically what might be the best play. It's like, get it out of my hand, right? You gotta move that ball along or you're going down. So there is this way in which there are plenty of abstract ideas that, you know, we can't deploy because we have to stay bound to our pathos in life. What is our actual situation we're suffering, not some abstract world of theory So I think Hegel talks about this, but he has difficulty with it, like we all do. It's like he's on firmer ground when he's talking about Begriff and Verstand, because we see that everywhere in modernity. The capacity that an amoeba or a slime mold has to sense its environment and sense itself, so that there is an awareness that's missing from the stone. This is a power. It's a huge power. It's as Kenneth alludes to earlier in this chapter. It's not that a stone has nothing, but that its sense of itself is a hardwired chemical locking together of its minerals into its form. It's not. There's no awareness involved in its self-structuring and self-cohesion. And likewise, if a flood of water comes along and rolls the stone 4 feet down the path, again, it's not that it isn't adjusting, but that the adjustment is hardwired, if you will, into the relationship between the stone, the water, the gravity, the momentum, and all these forces. It must suffer. It lacks the awareness to do anything but suffer. Begriff creates the possibility of something more than suffering. You could act, you could will, you could practice, right? These are not possible without Begriff. So Begriff gives you kind of a power of form over matter that without which you can't do it. Verstand, the intellectual capacity, the abstracting, willing capacity, gives you a power over Begriff. If all you have is Begriff, then you remain immersed like an infant or like an amoeba in the flow of life. Everything that is immediately happening to you is all consuming. But if you have Verstand, you can abstract yourself from the moment enough to make plans and recognize patterns, and then to will a different outcome than would have happened if you had merely adapted passively and directly, immediately, to what was happening to you. So there is a sense in which Begriff gives you one kind of form over matter power. Verstand gives you another kind of form over matter power, where we treat Begriff plus your physical integument as though together that's the matter. And now Verstand is the form that's imposing itself on them. It's like a higher level of form applied to a higher level of matter. And the problem that we've talked about in previous weeks is that both Begriff and Verstand have a tendency to become traps. They each repel and exclude the other. People tend to gravitate to one or the other. So do organisms, right? Most animals are almost entirely Begriff. If they have Verstand, they use it in service to their Begriff. The Begriff is the king. And for plenty of intellectual adults, not that we have any acquaintance with intellectual adults on this call, intellectual adults, they have the other problem where they get trapped by ideologies. They get stuck within their models, and they can't deal with the real world that's actually happening to them. They're so good at suppressing the parts that don't fit their theory and focusing on the parts that do, that they're not able to perceive when, for example, they forgot to eat breakfast because they were so tied up working, which I do almost every damn day, which is why, by the way, I eat during these sessions. I'm the eating philosopher, right? Why do I do? Because if I don't, it's just, I'm going to forget again. I'm always forgetting. I need help remembering my Begriff and the needs of my body, because I'm too Verstand. I do too much intellectualizing. But so this tells us some things, right? Each stage in this climb up out of being strictly passive matter towards being more active form comes with certain powers that you have that were not available at the previous level of development, but at the price of making certain categories of mistakes that the previous pattern of development was incapable of making. An intellectual can forget to eat in a way that my cat will never forget to eat. Right? She always keeps us focused on mealtime. She knows when she's supposed to be eating, and she will hurt us downstairs because she has not taken her eye off the ball. Her powers of Begriff are mighty powers, and I can only envy them because my Verstand gives me power over my Begriff at the price of giving me blind spots and a tendency to screw up my Begriff operations because I keep overriding them with my Verstand. So this is the issue. The more you go into the realm of spirit, if you're immortal, if you're one of us, right? The more you move into the realm of form and away from the realm of matter, the more mistakes you tend to make about the basics. Now you can do more advanced things, but at the price of screwing up the basics more often. And so the development, Hegel talks about the development of the third faculty, the middle way you're talking about, Phil, Vernunft, right? But it's not as easy to describe as the other two. The other two, because they repel each other, they become self-caricaturing and simple to talk about. You can at least get some bumper sticker slogans about Begriff or Verstand very easily, and then try to develop a more sophisticated understanding after that. But with Vernunft, there's no bumper sticker slogan, because in fact, the primary characteristic of Vernunft is that it repels the tendency the other two faculties have to get trapped in itself. It's all about not being trapped in a faculty. It's about, as Phil likes to say, equivocating between the Begriff and the Verstand, not letting either one rule you. And the only way to do that involves not letting yourself be ruled by Vernunft either. It's about not being ruled. It's about autarkia. It's about autonomia. So, in the quote, Geneva was asking about, this development of the stages of history, and how from a modern perspective, a stage of history is we just look at a number line of years and then we draw some lines through them and say, before this was, ancient and after this is medieval. And we draw another line and say, before this was medieval and after this is modern. This is how moderns think. We think very abstractly, but history is nothing like that. Right? History, things don't all change at the same time. It's not one day we woke up and we were all wearing modern clothes. It doesn't work like that, right? These transitions, they interpenetrate each other. They interact with each other. They happen complexly over long periods of time. And even to this day, you can find modern would-be medievals who want to return to, all government must submit to the church, and the church will have an orthodoxy, and all religions that don't obey that orthodoxy must be exterminated. And there's still people pushing for that, even though that's been out of date for 500 years, right? And that epoch's gone, but it still survives in us in numerous ways. Sometimes in people's, ideologies. Sometimes, for example, in the way that most corporations internally are run as a kind of economic feudalism, right? In which you have the serfs who labor for the master. There are all kinds of ways in which these older systems are still present, and so the relationship between these epochs doesn't lend itself to the kind of modern mechanical analysis where we chop things into parts and we say how the parts can be combined like Legos that snap together to make pieces. It's not like that. Or at least it doesn't seem that way to Kenneth Smith. It seems to him that the ancients are better on this, when the ancients say the primary metaphor for the world should not be a block, because hardly anything behaves like a block. The primary metaphor for the world should be an organism, because there is always some balance of form and matter in everything we look at. Hardly anything is 100% passive and static. Almost everything includes some degree of self-rule or self-shaping or self-deciding, even if it's just a little bit. And when you ignore that part, that's where a lot of the complexity in the world comes from, which means we're now not able to explain how things relate to each other because we're ignoring the part that explains that. So it's more natural to an ancient to look at, say, the ancient world or the medieval world or the modern world and say, these aren't blocks, these are organisms, like the bud, the blossom, and the fruit that Hegel writes about. This is why Hegel develops his dialectics of history. He says, anybody can just draw some lines in the ground. He said Kant could do that. But where it gets interesting is when you say, why and how did the medieval epoch develop out of the ancient? What was the course of development and life of the ancient world that necessitated the production of the medieval world? That they are not just two things we pit against each other, like a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis in a Kantian mode. That they are organisms that have grown out of one another in a Hegelian dialectical mode. And if we take this analysis, one of the strengths of it is that it looks at these forces of autonomia or autarkia by which an epoch holds itself together. It says this isn't just a collection of years and dates. This was a system for generating cultures that were compatible with each other and that understood the world and each other in a certain way. And because they understood it in a certain way, they responded to the world in a certain way, thus creating a pattern of effects that add up over time into big changes, to have a certain kind of feel to them, a certain character, certain direction. And that direction helps to explain why the medieval world would be born within and grow out of the ancient world, because the natural, normal activities, the metabolism of the ancient epoch was moving it away from its comfort zone and into the crisis that would cause the medieval epoch to be born from it. It didn't know what it was doing because it lacked the higher order faculties, cultural or civilizational or epochal faculties, required to see the consequences of its own actions, much like the rest of us, right? It's like every story ever written that's any good is all about what have we set in motion, whether we like it or not, and how are we going to deal with the consequences, right? The law of unintended consequences. This is close to the human condition. So Hegel is mimicking and building upon the ancients when he says that's not just true of an individual person. But when you get large numbers of people cooperating, they create a larger scale organism that has these same issues that we have. What does it see and what does it not see? In what ways is it passive and in what ways is it active? Matter versus form. And in how many of its consequences were intended and how many go awry from its plans? And how does that lead to the creation of the future? This is, you know, deep human nature stuff. So in that sense, it is, you know, part of what's interesting about the ancient / Hegelian take is that they're saying that, you know, the individual processes of thinking that you engage in over time help to generate and shape your own personal character, which is a larger scale phenomenon than any given thought that you have. And that character, that larger scale phenomenon, in turn shapes your thinking. There's a feedback loop. The more like a certain person you become, the more you tend to think thoughts that are compatible with that sort of person. They feed back on each other. And then if we have a certain character and think certain thoughts, we're likely to take certain actions in the world. We're going to converge on certain solutions to problems. And so over time, our behavior starts to have a character. Now, behavior isn't just inside our head. It's outside our head, so it's shared with each other. The people next to us have their behavior and so on. And these behaviors, if they're all incompatible, we can't get anything done. We don't survive, we fight each other. So over time, individuals align each other into compatible behaviors that generate cultures. I mean, either that or they get extinguished, right? You either make it work in the world or you don't. If you don't make it work, evolution has an answer for that problem. But if you can make it work in the world, evolution has a different answer, which is okay. You can keep going. You can persist and keep developing. So culture is generated out of behavior, which is generated out of character, which is generated out of thought. And each of these scales of order is like an organism, right? It's dialectical. And this is how cultures generate themselves. And then cultures have to align with each other or don't. If they don't, then they fail. But if they can, you get an epoch. So this question about, is it individuals or collectively? The answer is yes. It is exactly both at the individual level, 100%, and at the collective level, 100%, and how the two are dependent on each other, how they have to converge on each other and become compatible in order to survive. This is where these organisms of history come from, according to the ancients and according to Hegel. All of this is just, and you know, all of this, if you got any background in science, you know, there's a reason why this isn't just arbitrary. All of this is obeying the law of big numbers. The law of big numbers says, okay, you want to talk about one proton at a time, we can give you mathematical formulas for one proton at a time. We can say what its mass is, what its charge is. We can say how it interacts with one other proton or one electron. All of this stuff is almost mathematical. It's very easy. And it can be characterized in a way such that you would never mistake this description for any other particle. You wouldn't say, oh, that sounds like a neutron. You'd say, that has to be a proton. Certainly that's not an electron. Only a proton acts like this. But you get a bunch of protons together. I mean, a lot of protons, and then throw in neutrons and electrons, and they don't act that way anymore. This is the thing that's hard about science. When the numbers grow large, the number of interactions grow large, new laws of nature emerge as though out of nowhere. Modernism believes in this idea of reductionism. We think everything can be broken down into little pieces you just snap together. But the problem is, that's not how nature works. When you get very large numbers and very large numbers of interactions, new patterns emerge. And from them, we have to develop new sciences to explain atoms and molecules, which are different from the sciences that we use to explain individual particles and forces. In great numbers, you start to be able to get material science, for example, which is not something you wouldn't infer concrete from a proton. You could study a proton, you could be the master of a proton, you could know more about protons than any man has ever known, and you still would never conclude concrete as one of the implications. You have to go through chemistry and through mineralogy and all these other things before it starts to become clear what's going on, because the levels of complexity are too great, and the new emergent phenomena and behavior and laws that happen with each new stage of big numbers can't be foreseen from the stage below. This is what it's like when we think a thought. We don't know what the consequences are. We don't see how thinking a thought contributes to the creation of our character. We don't see how our character contributes to our behavior. We don't see how our behavior contributes to the generation of a culture, how that contributes to the generation of an epoch, and how epochs contribute to the generation of history. All of this stuff is additional levels of complexity, just like moving from particle physics to chemistry to mineralogy to organic chemistry and biochemistry and cellular biology and tissue biology and organism biology and ecology. All these things are just layers of complexity because of big numbers in which new laws emerge. And we have to study them too in order to understand the level above. That's what Hegel's trying to do for us. He's trying to turn what we have always thought of as the subjective stuff, the not so scientific, really, it's all kind of poetry stuff. He's trying to turn it into a science. And he's trying to do it by structuring it the exact same way that we structure the physical sciences, and saying, what is the simplest level? And then what emerges from that when you get large numbers of things at that level, and so on. So this is my long-winded answer to your short, simple, but very important question, which is, how do these epochs work? Do they, why, how do they create and maintain themselves? And it's like, it is these complex interactions between the individual and the group as they converge on a solution that works, that create the new larger order thing that happens. And I'm going to call on Stephen in just a second, but just to tie it all up and bring it home, all of this comes back to these issues of autonomia and autarkia. The thoughts or characters or behaviors or cultures or epochs that are capable of greater amounts of autonomia and autarkia are the ones that survive. And the ones that are not capable of as much are more passive, and thus they shape history less. They shape themselves less. There are differential powers here, for better or for worse. I'm not saying all good things flow from this, but I'm saying this is the ancient perspective. This is the Hegelian perspective. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just going to bring up the question of the kingdom of God.
Yes.
Which the medieval perspective, and of course that's still a big issue.
Yes. Because
a big chunk of the world is Islam.
Sure.
Muhammad was in ancient Arabia. He had the pagan, his corner of Arabia was still worshipped the pagan gods. It was still where pagan Rome had been a few centuries earlier. Anyway, but he brings the kingdom of God. So we see in another part of the world a transition.
We do.
Where he's saying, he seems to be going through the same process. There's something wrong here. The pagan way of doing things is degenerating, or not really successful, and now we're suffering because of it. But if we bring God in as the divine ruler, or in this case, the God of Abraham,
Right.
it's going to make a difference. And of course, it becomes a huge movement in the world. It's still
Right.
a huge chunk of the world. Now, the West has thrown that away, and it's brought forth its new system, which it calls liberal democracy. What happened to fraternity? Because the French Revolution cried the free, didn't it? It said liberty,
Liberté,
so we've got that in liberal. Egalite, we've got that in democracy. Democracy means we're all sort of equal, but fraternity hit its head blind drunk on the corner somewhere and got lost in the pub. But we've still got two up, and we're saying to the rest of the world, we're better than you because we have liberal democracy. And if we spread liberal democracy all over the world, everyone will be happy. Give up the old system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Even Vlad's over there in Russia. Surprisingly, the Orthodox Church comes up from under the snows and springs up like the flowers on the Russian soil, and the rationalists are thinking, what's going on here? This isn't fitting with my system. Islam, what's going on there? They should have seen the light of reason. What's going wrong? So we've got this big conflict is still going.
Right. Exactly. And this is part of the way in which the course of history is shaped. We come up with these models for how we think history is going to go, and we come up with different models. And the ones that can't predict what's happening run aground. They get into trouble. And the ones that do a better job of predicting, or at least aligning themselves with what's happening, they thrive. So here is, let's say, the Arabian Peninsula before Muhammad. And it's not that it's a backwater or anything. I mean, they've got a lot of civilization to work with. They've got a lot of technology and so on. But all around them, the Roman Empire is growing. It's not in its best phase right now. But let's say the barbarians are learning from the Romans how to organize themselves and be effective militarily and do engineering and so on. And Muhammad looks around at all this and says, if we keep resisting the epoch that is emerging, we are not going to thrive. And what we must do instead is embrace the core ideals of the new epoch. And it's not just a cynical, calculated movement the way it would be for a modern, where we just, we ran it through a calculator and it told us what to do, and so we did that. It is that Muhammad himself also feels that same impulse that Augustine and others are feeling, which is that, man, this corruption of the ancient world is just hard to fully come to grips with. And I'm not sure anybody can do it, but God can, because God's more powerful than we are. So God can overcome human corruption. All we have to do is put God in charge. But it can't be one of these weak ancient gods who's only in charge of the sea or only in charge of war or what have you. It has to be an all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing, all-good God. If you put him in charge, then he's got the awareness and understanding and intelligence and reach and benevolence to make everything better. I mean, when you boil it down, when you look at how bad things were getting under the late stage Roman Empire, and then you look at the proposition of medievalism in its barest terms, it's irresistible. There's a reason why it spread like crazy. I mean, it's, frankly, under those circumstances, it sounds like the most plausible answer. That's why it caught on, and why it would catch on not just within a single culture or a single continent, but would catch on all over the place in one form or another. So yeah, I'm with you, Stephen. And the challenge for moderns, like the challenge for anybody in any epoch, is we don't fully understand the epoch we're in. It's a little easier, not saying it's easy, But it's a little easier to look back 500 or 1,000 years after you've seen the consequences of actions and say, oh, that's what that epoch was about. But when you're in it, you have a mix of things that you're seeing clearly about your epoch and things that you're not seeing clearly about your epoch. Some of your tools for understanding the world are the tools of the previous epoch that have not yet been shed. And in some cases, when we shed those out-of-date tools, we find that the tools that remain are inadequate to the task. New tools need to be developed to understand the epoch, and we haven't done that yet. Yeah, Hegel certainly ripped off Lessing. He knew about Lessing. He read Lessing. So anyway, all right. So this is, all of this is to just sketch in, right? I mean, I've spent an hour at this. All of this is to sketch in the shape of how we got to section D, right? This is the background for section D. And with this as the framework for understanding the ancient world, Kenneth Smith is now ready to take us into the next section. He wants to talk to us about arete, or natural excellence. Natural excellence is a definition of arete. There's a number of ways to define arete, but he's going to say this, in all the previous ones, I mean, look at these other sections: form and matter, organicism and arete. Or the one before, custom and nature, aristocracy and philosophy. Or the first one, right? Nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. He's always talking about pairs of things or four things at a time sometimes and showing how they relate to each other. Not this time. We've done enough of that. Section D is about one thing and one thing only. It's about arete. Natural excellence is just a definition of arete. So this is going to be a far more focused section. So as Donald said, these paragraphs are going to sing. They're making a core focus point armed with the work that we've done in the previous sections. So how does he begin? Every natural organism is endowed with a repertory of active organizing powers. And we know what that means. Let's talk about that for a moment. Natural. He doesn't mean natural like as opposed to artificial per se. He means the realm of phusis, or becoming, the realm of intrinsic truth. Real organisms, authoritative organisms, things that are actually so, not things that we call so. He's distinguishing the realm of nature from the realm of our ideas. This is an existentialist versus escapist distinction he's making by saying natural here. So next up, is endowed with a repertory of active organizing powers. Active organizing powers, at this point, we should recognize that in a nutshell. We're talking about the realm of will. We're talking about the realm of form that imposes itself on matter. This is why this comes after the section on form and matter, right? And as we said, it is what defines an organism. It is what living things have that non-living things don't have hardly any of, is this capacity to impose form on matter, so they can shape themselves and their own behavior, even when they're not being directly stimulated from the outside. And they can respond to the world outside them without waiting for it to slap them in the face. They can sense the world and adjust to the world. All of this is the use of the faculties within their repertory of active organizing powers to be alive to the world, to have not just pathos, where they must suffer the world, but praxis, where they act in the world to adjust themselves in their relationship to the world. This is our subject. Every natural organism is endowed with a repertory of active organizing powers. These are instincts, intuitive forms of intelligence that evaluate what is good, essential, healthy, and nutritious for a specific creature. This is not the realm of generalities. This is not noesis or Verstand. We're talking about a specific creature in specific circumstances. What is good? What is good for the slime mold right now? What does it need to do next? Well, that depends, right? It depends on what's around it. So we're talking about contingency. Is there still enough of that yummy bacteria for it to consume that's emitting camp and leaving a little trail around to say, oh, the yummy bacteria is just if I just extend a pseudopod, oh yeah, that's delicious, right? Or is it in circumstances where the camp is getting faint because it's eaten so much of the bacteria nearby? and it's starting to risk starvation mode. Because if those are its specific circumstances right now, then what's good for it is different. It needs to do something different than it would have done. All of this is built into what he's saying here. He says, what is essential? What is essential? And we don't just mean what's important. To the Greeks, what is essential is core to your character, right? The essential parts of you are the parts that remain when the moment-to-moment details fall away. What is the core of you? And it's the core of you because if it weren't for that core, you wouldn't be you. These are the things that make you what you are, right? Evaluating what is at the core. What is healthy and what is nutritious? Those are pretty straightforward in a sense. So he's talking about here this idea of, he's defining instincts as intuitive forms of intelligence. They are forms of intelligence that don't require noesis. You don't need a calculator or a system of logic in order to arrive at these conclusions. A slime mold doesn't even need a neuron. I mean, no brain, no nervous system at all. And yet still, it has intuitive forms of intelligence to evaluate what is good, essential, healthy, and nutritious for that particular slime mold, right? So we're breaking away from certain modernist categories about who does or doesn't have intelligence. We're saying, you don't need a brain to have intelligence. You just need to have this capacity of form that gives you the ability to respond to the world in more than passive ways. And if you've got that, then there is an intelligence to you, neuron or no neuron. And importantly, this opening sentence, when you put it together, this is like a definition of autonomia or autarkia, right? Nomos are the rules by which we live. If you are heteronomos, hetero is other, nomos is the rules. It means that you either need to be or are being governed by somebody else's rules. Somebody needs to govern you because you're not governing yourself. Heteronomos. Autonomos, auto means self, means that the rules come from yourself. You are governing yourself. You don't need a police officer with a billy club there slapping it to get you to do the right thing. You do the right thing because those are your rules for yourself. You're ruling yourself. Even if the way in which you're ruling yourself is compatible with a heteronomous set of laws, if you are not waiting to be punished, if you're not, just passively like a ping pong ball responding to, rewards and punishments, if you are generating your own sense of right and wrong in the world, then you are autonomous. The rules, the nomos, the rules are coming from yourself. And likewise, autarkia. Auto again is self. Archaea is a reference to arche, to the founding principles that generate order. So even aside from the question of rules, just where do your patterns come from, right, in your behavior? What makes you characteristically who you are? And if you're a stone, you have a heterarchaea, right? It was a volcano, or it was sedimentation at the bottom of an ocean, or it was the pressures within the earth, or it was something that made you what you are. And now that they formed you, you exist because of them. This is a very mechanical kind of existence. You had to be formed by something else. And when people think about designers and architects and planners, when they think about the building of machines, all of that is heterarchaea, right? Somebody makes a factory or they make the tools or a workplace and they construct the thing. The thing doesn't construct itself. It's heterarcheous. But autarky is a capacity that all living things have, where they make themselves. They form themselves, including forming within them their own arche or principles that are going to go on throughout their life, shaping and reshaping and readapting themselves to fit that inner group of arche, those inner principles, right? Nobody builds a cat the way we build a toaster. The cat builds itself from the kitten, which builds itself from the embryonic cat, which builds itself from the fertilized cell, the original fertilized egg within. And yes, it benefits enormously from the womb and the nutrition and the protection and all these things that are required to create a safe zone for it and to help guide it. But just like teaching a kid, you can't just pour a clone of your mind into their mind. That's not how it works. They're not heterarchious, they're autarchious. They have to shape themselves. That's what a living thing does. So autonomia and autarkia are closely related to each other. The rules you set for yourself are based on your arche or character. So this opening sentence, he's defining autonomia without saying the word autonomia. He's defining autarkia, and he's harnessing the concepts of physis and form and matter and everything we've talked about in sections A, B, and C. It's all coming together in the opening sentence to define what does it mean to be an organism within nature. And since that's the metaphor that the ancients used to understand everything, including themselves and history, you can see why it's so important that he puts this metaphor together for us. Without this, we would be busy misinterpreting everything the ancients said in some modernist way that isn't like this at all. We might think that things are abstract categories. We might think that people are more like stones and you just make them do whatever you want. There's all kinds of conclusions we could reach if we don't have this fundamental metaphor of the organism as conceived by an ancient, or by Hegel, or by Smith. So now that we're armed, every creature confronts the world resourced with its own private armamentarium of resources. See that doing battle metaphor he's doing here, right? He's drawing off of Heraclitus here. War is the father of all things, right? And he doesn't mean, put on a suit of armor and go chop people's heads off. He means that the forces in the world are not really a cradle designed above all to protect us and nurture us. We can be protected and nurtured in the world, and we can learn to protect and nurture ourselves and each other, but it's not the only thing the world has to offer. The world offers both nurturing and, you can also be ground underfoot and crushed. It's a dangerous place that we have to learn and respect. And so it's like what they tell people who are learning how to hike or camp. You have to respect nature. Nature's not there for you. If you go out there without respecting the dangers of nature, you're going to get in trouble. Yes, you need to understand the good things about nature. What are the berries you can eat? Where's the clean water? Where can you make shelter? There's a lot of things nature has to offer us that are positive, but it also has, rattlesnakes and cliffs, diseases to offer us too. So you can neither go into the world assuming you're safe, nor go into the world assuming it's out to get you. It's doing both at the same time. And you need to engage with it in a kind of, in a struggle. Like a struggle that you would have with a partner, not with a dedicated enemy. If you're learning to wrestle, the job of the other guy is to wrestle with you, not to pat you on the head and stroke you and tell you what a good person you are. And they don't want to hurt you necessarily, but they might hurt you by accident if you don't bring a certain level of self-protection and care into the relationship. Like, for example, to pat the floor 3 times if your arm is pulled back too far to keep it from being broken. If you don't know that trick, if you haven't added that to your armament of protocols for relating to each other, you could get your arm broken very easily when you're wrestling. And that's, a simplified situation. Agon is the word I'm looking for. Agon, which means struggle, right? Life is an agon. And we don't mean it's just an agony and it's miserable and everything sucks and too bad. That's not what we're saying at all. We're saying that life requires of us that we wrestle with it. And in that wrestling match, we want to bring our wonder and our love and all of these things, but we also want to bring an armamentarium of resources, talents, gifts, skills, the things that we're really good at to help us to relate to the world in a way that's safe and nourishing for us. All that stuff from the first sentence is made possible by this armamentarium, these talents, these gifts, these skills, these things that we're good at. And, he says, the actions at which it is singularly good. What are you better at, right? Because if you try to outrace a cheetah on foot, you're going to be in trouble. The cheetah is singularly good at running. And if your problem right now is that a cheetah wants to take a bite out of your leg, you better not try to deploy running as your strategy against the cheetah. The question is not, what are you good at? I mean, sure, maybe you can outrun all the people next to you, but you got to outrun the cheetah. The question is, what can you do that the cheetah can't do? What are you better at? What are you singularly good at? Right? That's how you're going to avoid being eaten or chased down by the cheetah, not by getting in a foot race with the cheetah. So he's talking here not about equality, but about diversity. What's distinctive about you? What are your special talents? And of course, as we've said in earlier weeks, talking about the earlier sections, for Homo sapiens, our distinctive talent is culture. Culture is the thing that we do more than they do. Every animal species has a culture, but only human beings have thousands of cultures. We're culture fountains. We're constantly generating cultures, even incredibly different cultures. Looking at the world in different ways, thinking about it in different ways, relating to it in different ways, relating to each other in different ways, forming larger scale organisms through our relationships with one another is something we're spectacularly good at. Now, anybody who raises bees, say honeybees, knows that, they're not all exactly identical. You can find less aggressive honeybees or more aggressive honeybees, sometimes even in the same species. I joined these bee groups this year because we got mason bees, which don't have hives or honey or wax. But anyway, I wanted to learn about bees. And even people who've been keeping hives for 15 years and are great at it will tell you, yeah, I got this new hive of bees and I'll be damned if they don't sting me every time I go out. It's the damnedest thing. None of my other hives have ever stung me in 15 years. I've figured out how to relate to them. They know me and I know them and it's fine. Here comes the next group of bees and it's the same exact species, but these ones want to sting me. Why? Who knows? Right? There's diversity, right? And you have to be sensitive and aware of it. And you have to have an armamentarium of resources and say, what are the things that I can do that a bee can't do to outsmart the bee and figure out how am I going to behave differently here? Even within a species, there's diversity. And that's why he says, the actions at which it is singularly good. We're not just talking about generic resources here. We're diving down through the levels of abstraction all the way to the individual, saying, what are you good at? Whatever that is, whatever the things are you're best at, that's going to be in your bag of tricks that you draw out when something from nature comes at you that's better than you at other things, right? No trying to flap your arms and outfly a peregrine falcon. No trying to get on a foot race with a cheetah. No trying to hold your breath longer than a fish. We're going to lose all those battles. The question is, what do we do that they don't do? That's how we're going to do it. So I'm gonna close this out and then I'll call on Phil. The end of this paragraph is the Greeks take arete. Arete is their term for this, natural excellence, talent that can be developed into a virtuosity. That is fundamental in making sense of nature. That is, as a factor that all life has in common. Every single living thing, from a great racer who can outfoot race anybody on Earth, all the way down to, an amoeba, which is not known for its velocity. They all have this in common, that they have to be very aware of what is their collection of, what is their arete? What are they best at? What do they have to work with in the agon with life and with nature and the world? What are your special gifts? This is arete. This is what this entire section is about. And everything before this was leading up to this in sections A, B, and C. It's all about explaining why the Greeks are obsessed with arete. And if you think it through, and he's going to talk it through some in the paragraphs that come, but if you think it through, you can see why they would be obsessed with arete, given the focus of the previous sections, right? Why is it the ancients who developed the Olympic Games, the Nemean Games, the Isthmian Games? Why them? Because they needed opportunities to cultivate and develop and show off arete, to inspire other people to cultivate their arete. They're obsessed with helping people to figure out what their strengths are and to develop them as far as they can take them. And why do they have everybody read the Iliad. Up until now, I've been saying, well, it's because there was this horrible calamity in which people, through their strengths, caused this horrible dark age. They tore apart the very thing they cared the most about, and the Greeks didn't want to do that. That's all true, but that's not the only reason. The other reason is that the reason that these people are their heroes is because each of them is an exemplar of some arete. What Achilles can do, Achilles does better than anyone else, right? It's made abundantly clear that when he enters the fight, it swings the course of the battle, because nobody can fight like Achilles. And when they can't get into the city, they need Odysseus's wiliness. Nobody's wily like Odysseus. Nobody. There's no chance. The Trojans can't resist the wiliness of Odysseus, just like Hector can't resist, the combative fierceness of Achilles. They're saying figuring out what people's arete is and organizing everything around that arete is the key to life, they say. Amoebas do it, peregrine falcons do it, cheetahs do it, we have to do it too. This is core to the ancient worldview. And you can see how this is very different from the idea that we're all equal. And normally, if we say that people aren't equal, we assume that the reason we're doing it is because we want to say other people aren't as good as we are, and we should be, in charge of them and tell them what to do, and they should work for us. This is a modernist interpretation of what you do with diversity. You use it to exploit each other. What else could it be for, we think, because we're moderns. We've got 500 years of, genocide and slavery and world wars and all these other things in which we've illustrated what we like to do about diversity. And it's not that the ancients didn't have any of those things, but that the ancients' relationship to diversity was very different. It wasn't just about exploitation per se and dominance. It was about everything. Diversity was the key to life to them. Arete is the key to life. And cultivating arete, therefore, becomes one of the core concerns of culture. It's why, to the ancients, it's why we gather in cultures. The purpose of a culture is not merely to hold itself together, but to create a cradle within which the natural, distinctive gifts of that population, of each person in that population, can be brought out and cultivated to their highest level. So that together, we have a wide, powerful armamentarium of talents, gifts, and skills that allow that culture to overcome a wider variety of problems than one in which everybody has the same stupid pet trick. If we've all got the same stupid pet trick, then there's really only one kind of problem that we can overcome. But if we have a whole bunch of different really good stupid pet tricks that we're great at, then our culture could thrive and survive for a longer period of time. All right, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I kind of have a little problem with this in this sense. It's like, yeah, I do think that there is a difference between culture and nature. And I don't know whether that evolved in a sense to separate us from nature, because the problem I have with nature, in some sense, on a deep level, not on a surface level, is that at the bottom, it's about survival. And in some sense, at the very bottom, the root of it is like nature, as good as it looks, it is a killing field. And because even when you think about ecology, it's there are pockets of ecological niches to survive, but even within that niche, there are plenty of shrimps and crustaceans that die in order that the marlin could survive. I mean, it's just like, and so it seems to me only in culture is it possible to develop something. Well, maybe I shouldn't go quite so far, because there are certain tribal things within species that have some sense of compassion and some sense of empathy, but generally not to the other species as much. Okay, maybe a little bit, but mostly no. It's a matter of, like, getting through the day to the next day. And we have developed a culture that we desire to, in a sense, have some empathy and sympathy for others, not only for the survival of the culture, but for the survival of just the respect for people who are in some ways caught in the undertows of the culture. And so I accept that diversity. But the problem is, I think within the culture, there are always those people who are driven by the root cause, which is survival. The problem with human being is that we exceed the needs of what we need, right? It's like our appetite have become so plentiful that, like, just having enough is not enough. We want to have more for various reasons, to emphasize how wonderful we are. I have more than you, whatever it is. So there might be something, it's counter to the development of culture that is rooted in something fundamental, like, oh, yeah, we want to turn the culture also into a killing field. You can't survive. That's your problem, because that's nature's law. To kill or be killed. I mean, how, in a way, if you're going to have a system that actually believe that the fundamental law of the universe, of the world, is survival in a killing field, that you could then somehow say, no, we will violate that fundamental law and produce a kinder and gentler culture. I mean, isn't that violating
Let's
the
talk about it.
nature of nature itself in some
Let's talk
sense?
about it.
I am clearly not in that mode, but I even asking myself, like, at what point, would the long knives come out, even in my situation, when it comes right down to it? I haven't seriously thought of it, but I have recently thought, maybe it is time to get a gun. All these other guys have guns, maybe I need to get one, rather than just say, when they come in, and just say, oh, let's be reasonable, guys. Like, could we talk this through, How about if I give you $100? Would that be okay? I mean, like, I just don't know. I mean, what I'm saying is there are counter forces within this,
yes,
that are still caught in some sense in a rudimentary thing that in some sense might be actually more rudimentary than culture itself, which sort of seemed to float, to exist in a floating world.
This is the Hegelian argument. If culture is arising out of all these previous levels, they include the level of, natural existence. That's part of where all this is coming from. And so it's not surprising that we see patterns passing upward through the levels into these more complex states. But where we get into trouble is, as moderns, we try to reduce everything by the law of the excluded middle. So nature should either be all good and compassionate, an example we should follow, or it's all bad and hostile and we should not do it. And the idea that it is both at the same time, in very complicated ways, it's hard for moderns. It was not nearly as hard for ancients. They took this sort of thing for granted, but we don't. Our mathematics and logic tell us that, true is true and false is false. And so nature is either good or bad, and we have to decide which one it is. And then we have to suppress all the evidence to the contrary in order to create a perception of the world that seems self-consistent. So what do we see in nature when we look at it? Well, for, flowering plants that depend upon pollinators make up an enormous percentage of the food chain. If there were not symbiotic, commensurate, mutualistic relationships between pollinators and plants, none of us would be here.
Yeah.
Some other species would have evolved, right? We evolved within a world that depends upon mutualism and cooperation. Now, that doesn't mean that, a leopard still won't eat your face. And, if in modern politics you vote for the leopards eating people's faces party, you shouldn't be surprised if the leopards eat your face. There is also, at the same time that there is mutualism and commensuralism, there is also, competition, predation, hostility. But it can't be resolved to either one or the other. It isn't one or the other. It is both at the same time. Another classic example of this is that, I did a bunch of reading last year in preparation for a series of articles I was going to write for Facebook and then didn't. My life in a nutshell. Looking at the evolution of Homo sapiens and what is the same or different in us compared to our closest ape and primate and other relatives. And one of the most striking things about Homo sapiens compared to the others is that we have more clearly distinct stages of development through childhood than the apes do. And we and the apes together have more stages of development through childhood than the other primates do. There are plenty of mammal species that go directly from child to adult or have only a brief period in between. But we have like 6 stages to adulthood, and they're all very different from each other. There's been interesting work in the last 25 years exploring why these stages evolved in us and what their consequences are. But one of them is by giving birth to infants earlier when they're less developed, we're able to have adults grow larger brains. This is a much discussed issue in evolution, right? To have a brain this big, if we waited until the normal level of development that we would expect from a mammal, there literally isn't enough room in the pelvis to pass the baby through. It wouldn't fit. So we basically give birth to premature infants compared to any other mammal. And that makes that possible. And obviously, since we value our intelligence, we can see the importance of that. But we also, along the way, we developed this thing about baby teeth. You ever thought much about how weird baby teeth are? You put all that energy in developing one set of teeth just to throw them out and get another set of teeth. What the hell's up with that? I mean, we're not sharks who are constantly working our way through teeth. Why would there be 2 stages of teeth? And the answer is because in mammals, breastfeeding suppresses fertility. And you only have 2 breasts. So you can only carry so many kids and breastfeed them at the same time. So there's a problem. If you have to wait until this premature infant matures to the stage that they can eat adult food on their own at the pace a normal mammal would develop, then you can only have a maximum of two kids at that stage of development at a time. It slows down the reproductive rate of Homo sapiens. So instead, we develop these early teeth. So there's this pretty quickly, compared to a lot of our close relatives, our infants can start eating solid food. And the moment that they can do that, the mother can then go have another child. And so our fertility rate was bumped compared to gorillas or chimpanzees or the other really close apes. This is one of the big differences between us, this stage right here. And they're pretty clear this is the reason. So what is the consequence? And there's other stages, but I'm just going to stop here for a moment. What is the consequence of these 2 stages? Well, if you're a horse and you give birth to a colt and 2 hours later it's running around on its all 4 feet and can keep up with you, your herd can move on. But if you give birth to something that can't even hold its head up, let alone walk, and it's not going to walk for ages, now what? What does that mean? Well, you have to cooperate. You must cooperate. People have to stay nearby and protect the infant, and they have to protect the mother whose mobility is limited by the limited mobility of the infant. The same is true for the stage in which you have baby teeth. Part of the definition of this stage in Homo sapiens is that you can eat solid food, but you're too small and weak to hunt it down for yourself. And your brain's not developed enough to make clear distinctions between poisonous plants and non-poisonous plants. You're too easily fooled, right? The survival rate would be terrible. So the only way that second stage works in Homo sapiens is through cooperation. You need people to stick around and hunt the food for the infant, right? They can eat it, but they can't acquire it. Somebody else has to acquire it, and then they eat it. So the formation of culture and complex society and relationships is not just something we happen to have. You can directly map it onto these additional stages of the development from childhood to adulthood in Homo sapiens, especially in the distinctive stages that we have that others don't. It's really interesting work that's been going on. And the same is true for the stage that comes after that when they get their adult teeth, but they're still small. And it turns out the same is true for adolescence, which, as any parent of adolescents will tell you, is a cursing and a blessing. It's a blessing and a cursing at the same time. They have these amazing new powers, but where is the hell is their judgment? It's like they will do things that you would expect of a little child while having the pride and defensiveness of an adult about it. And, there are certain crises that happen around that stage, and they imply certain things about the development of our culture as well. So Phil, we look at a species like Homo sapiens, and what we see is at the precise same time, there are right down to our bones and teeth and stages of development, there are clear signs that we are expected to cooperate, right? And the domestication of animals follows naturally as a consequence of the way that we treat each other. All these things kind of come as a big package. But at the same time, we also have enormous amounts of ourselves that are clearly about competition. Cannibalism is not unheard of, in the history of mankind. It's not just the leopards that might eat your face, right? So our challenge is that it is both at the same time. We can't either be optimistic or pessimistic about it. We have to see that we need both sets of talents. And this is one of the ways in which political parties often collapse. You often get political parties that are all about love and sweetness or are all about fighting and warfare, and they're both wrong. It is both at the same time, and that's what makes it too tricky to fit onto a bumper sticker slogan or a campaign speech. The truth of our condition is messy and complicated. And that means that the things that we have to learn from nature, if we are studying nature, we're subject to nature, what does that mean as far as what our choices are? That gets complicated too, right? There's no easy path through this. Plenty of escapist slogans and memes, but the real path through requires the development of that third faculty of intelligence, the equivocation you talk about. So I know that's a not entirely satisfactory answer, but I appreciate you bringing up the issue. So yes, so the opening paragraph section about arete, he basically is making the point that given the previous three sections, you could see why the ancients are obsessed with arete and why they even have a word for it that's just for this, right? They aren't cobbling together. They're not trying to say natural excellence or talents that can be developed into virtues, or they're not trying to find their way indirectly to this concept. They want a single word that is about this one thing, because they're going to talk about it a lot, and everything is going to be organized around it. It's one of the most central concerns of the ancient world. What are your specific gifts, and what have you done to cultivate them? And by you, we both mean you as an individual and you as a group. And at multiple levels of groups. What's your family's special arete? What's your city or neighborhood's arete? What's your culture's arete? What's your epoch's arete? What's your species' arete? There's got to be aretes at every level because of this nesting of levels of complexity. And you can see how this is just a natural way to think for the ancients. These are the metaphors they bring to bear. If you ask them any question on any subject, or they look out their window and look at anything, they're immediately thinking about arates. That's how they think. They aren't looking out there and thinking, what if there's something out there I can eat? Or maybe I could, chop something up and make a tool out of it. And then thinking to themselves, and that's all there is. Instead, they're looking out there and they're seeing the arete of the bee and the arete of the hummingbird and the arete of the rosemary plant, which I'm looking at right now, which continues to baffle me because through July and August, it sheds almost half of its needles and looks like it's dying. So much so that people start thinking, I better prune back these dead branches. But no, wait a little longer and the needles start to come back. And now it's in a state where it's looking really mangy and draggly because it's got some needles, but lots of branches that are like, are you sure that's not a dead branch? Except, hey, it's September, it's October, it's got flowers all over it. It's like not even finished putting its needles back. And it's like, woo, sexy time. And it's got a point, right? As a strategy, it's changing out its leaves during the summer so that during the winter, when it has rebuilt its complete collection of needles, it has every possible opportunity to soak up the dim sunlight, right? It's taking the opposite strategy of all these other leaf plants around us. It has an arete, and it's good at it. But it means to me, it looks at times pitiful and weird when it's going through its molting stage. But that's okay. I don't have to understand it or appreciate it. It's arete. I'm not the one losing my hair in the summer and growing it back in the fall, the way it is. All right. So naturalism. So let's we have time to move on to the next paragraph. I think we should do that. So let me drop that in the chat here. Although I should pause and say, Sharon, you had your hand up for a bit, like you were going to say something, and then you took it back down. Did you want to jump in and say what you had in mind? No? Okay. Just making sure I'm not running over the opportunity. Okay, it is the genius of animals that they spontaneously cultivate the abilities that are good for them. We got kittens, I think I've mentioned before. A month ago, we got 2 kittens. They were 5.5 and 6.5 months old when we got them. And our current kitty is 15. She's she knows our ways, we know her ways. She's getting old and creaky. She doesn't jump as high as she used to, but she still likes her sunbeams and she likes to be petted and she knows when it's time to eat. But you get kittens and it's all bets are off, right? They are just like, they are adorable little killing machines. They have murder mittens, right? And they, unlike an adult cat, they don't know that you're going to be unhappy with them if they dive up, land on your back, and climb the rest of the way up to your shoulder. They don't know that. Surya would never do that to me. But these kittens would do it in a heartbeat because they don't know the consequences of their actions. When they're throwing themselves at you to get pets, they miss sometimes and fall off the bed. Like, gravity is still a big surprise to them. And they race about upstairs with an enthusiasm that belies, natural laws, bouncing off the door. It is insane. I sit down here in the mornings when I'm working and writing, and up above me, it's like, wildebeests of the Serengeti. They're just galloping back and forth up there. Blump, 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 crash, blump, 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 blump. And why are they doing that? Because they are spontaneously cultivating the abilities that are good for them. Being very fast, being able to jump very high, being extremely hyper alert to any intriguing little, motions in the shadows or little sounds that other people might miss, stalking, pouncing, all that. They have to become good at that. And it is in their nature as kittens to do it obsessively and frankly turned up to 11, which is why we start them in a room of their own before we inflict them on the rest of the house. We're gonna have to kitten-proof this house before we let them out of that room because, they break everything. But they have to. It is their genius as little cats that they need to be obsessed with and delighted by the activities that are going to make them exceptional hunters. And as Jackson Galaxy says on his YouTube videos, the cat is not like the dog. It has not been massively domesticated. It's a paper thin veneer and of civilization. And right underneath it is the raw cat who still needs to do the things that a lion needs to do, and has all the behaviors and all the drives and desires and affections and obsessions that a lion has. The cat, there's a wild cat is pretty much what we have, with just a little bit of domestication on top. So it gives you an opportunity to see what he's talking about here. It is their genius that they just developed that on their own. There's no cat up in that room with them, teaching them to gallop around like maniacs, teaching them to pounce and leap, and they're doing it. Their capacity to do that is greater than our capacity as Homo sapiens to do the same thing because of the course of our evolution. Most animals are spectacularly good at this. We sort of are born weirdly generic. They do not need to become conscious or articulate about it. Kittens, dogs, elephants, whatever. They do not need the exhortations of teachers and fellow citizens. Although they do benefit from having adults around to model themselves on, they will still develop themselves as best they can without it. Any animal is a more self-sufficient practical organism than any human. This is a core point among the ancient Greeks, in Hegel, but especially in Kenneth Smith. This idea that we may be animals, but we are not like the other animals. We may be apes, but we are not like the other apes. There are many ways in which it is just like we were talking about with Phil. There is this weird equivocation between the ways in which we are like them and the ways in which we are not like them. And you can't let the modernist law of the excluded middle tempt you into coming down on either side of that and trying to argue we either entirely are or we entirely aren't. The ways in which we are like other living organisms are incredibly important, and we don't understand Homo sapiens unless we understand those comparisons and relationships. But the ways in which we are different from others are equally important. And if we don't appreciate and understand those, again, we don't understand Homo sapiens. The ancients were not bound by the law of the excluded middle the way we are. They have no problem with a paradox. So they can look at people and see, on the one hand, yes, we're organisms and yes, we're animals and all those things. But on the other hand, there is an artifice to us that is missing from most animals, or turned way down. Like in most animals, it's at a 1, and in us, it's turned up to 11. This is our stupid pet trick. The fact that we are born generic animals and can be cultured into an incredibly diverse variety of adults, depending on our acculturation. That's who we are. But the price of that is that we are less self-sufficient and less practical an organism than any other animal. An amoeba has its act together better than a human being does. This is what he's saying, right? We are communal creatures, interdependent on others, on language, and this is the core point, not just on others, but on language, education, culture, politics, technology, religion, etc. For the morale that animals naturally secrete within themselves. I like that idea of morale like a bodily fluid that your body secretes. But you spend, I introduced my sister to the kittens, and she was in there, I think, all of 60 seconds before she started giggling. I mean, the morale of a kitten hits you in the face. They are so delighted with themselves and their world. And if you give them a moment with you, it's like this boundless morale. And even Surya, she's got a cough right now. She's got a lung infection. I got to get antibiotics. After this, I'm driving down to the vet to pick up antibiotics to give her, and so she's not feeling as good as she always does, but she's had coughs before and she'll have coughs again. And it's just part of the, what she goes through because of the lung damage she had early on. But even she secretes her own morale. She sees the sunbeam, the late fall sun comes in under the eaves deeper into the house than the summer sun did. And, she hops down and walks over and plops herself right into it. She sees, that it's time for food, and boy, she's back up on her feet and comes yow, yow, yow at us to tell us all about what we need to do next. She secretes morale naturally. Most animals do. It's part of their wiring. But if we did that, if Homo sapiens did that, it would get in the way of us being able to be acculturated to fit different cultures. Any fixed part of us that was obsessed with one thing and it had to have would mean that any culture that wasn't about that thing would have trouble generating members of the culture. So as a result, our enthusiasms and morales are more malleable. Most of us go to a junkyard and we look at the junk and go, okay, well, that's some junk. Some of it might be interesting or neat, but we're picky about which of it we're going to touch because we don't know where it's been. But in walks Picasso, and he sees a broken down bicycle, and he says, "Oh my God, it's a bull!" Woo! And everyone else is like, "What?" He says, "Look!" He picks up the seat and he holds up the handlebars. He says, "Look, it's the head and the horns of a bull." And everyone goes, "Oh yeah, I kind of see that." But he doesn't go, "I kind of see that." He goes, "Woo! Woo! I'm Picasso. I made a bull out of garbage. I saw a bull that was there the whole time and nobody else could see it." He had morale, right? He had enthusiasm for this junk. He saw that it was art. It wasn't just old rusty art. It was new art that the original creators hadn't even conceived of. And maybe if the paint hadn't faded, he wouldn't have seen it as clearly. But there it was. Where did that morale come from? Well, it didn't come from the same place that the kitten's morale come from, I can tell you that. It's because of his life and acculturation as an artist.
Could we have that word, please? Stupepetric?
Say it again.
Stupepetric? It's our Stupepetric, or?
Oh, sorry. Stupid space pet space trick. Stupid pet tricks. This is a term out of gaming culture. And from playing games. Like in chess, each piece has a different trick that it can do, how it moves and how it can take things. And when you're a game designer, part of what you're trying to do is lay out what are the different kinds of pieces that they can play with, and what is the stupid pet trick of each piece. And it's a stupid pet trick because it's not sufficient. You need all the pieces to play the game. If you only had one, if all you had was bishops, you wouldn't be playing chess.
Google wasn't working for me on this one.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Nor Bing.
It's my jargon.
The AI is going to have to be upgraded.
That's right. So yeah, stupid pet trick. Every, or and of course it comes from all those, America's favorite home videos. What have I taught my pet to do that no other pet can do? What is my one unique thing? So I don't mean it in a derogatory sense. It's just a gaming term of art, gaming, shall we say. So morale, right? We secrete morale within ourselves, partially based on our biology. I mean, you feel better after a nice meal than you do after you've been starving yourself for 4 days. Speaking of someone who fasts once a month, I can confirm that even though I fast enthusiastically and I'm happy to do it, by day 4, my morale is not what it was on day 1. And in a couple more days when I break my fast, my morale's going to come right back up. It's the biology, right? There's limits to how much culture can mold you. But within those limits, mostly our morale comes from our acculturation. What has worked for us and not worked for us? Where has excitement been rewarded and where has it been stifled? Each of us has our own characterological constellation of sources of morale. And those sources secrete morale within us based on our life experience and acculturation. And that's what allows us to get through life. That's our get up and go that we need to, get up and go. Or as they used to say in the 60s, to get turned on. What turns us on? So why don't I pause here and we'll call on Donald and then Phil. Go ahead, Donald.
When I was younger, there was a sort of, I don't know if it was a movement or an idea or whatever, but natural man. The problem with man was he had culture. He needed to be natural. And especially on Indigenous People Day, this was something that only Indigenous people could possibly have, being natural, but that was more self-critique or
60s.
something. Huh?
That was the 60s.
The 60s, yeah. And yet Kenneth here, who's I know has been saying this since the 60s, you know, it's that word in the last sentence. There's a word of the first paragraph, developable. There must be, every culture must have its paideia. It's means for turning children, babies, whatever, into adults. This does not happen spontaneously. It's one of the stupid pet tricks we don't have, is that we can mature completely on our own, apart from somehow this gets, we get this exposure. And I just wondered if you could maybe have some perspective. You seem to have read everything. So talk about these. I mean, there are lots of things that go on in modernity. I mean, yes, there's delusion, escapism, there's all these things, but sometimes when we try and get rid of them, it's just another ridiculous position that is itself an escapist delusion, such as we need to be people without culture.
Right, right.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah, this is what I can speak to because I was raised by people who believed in that stuff from the 60s. It didn't end well. So, just be natural, do what comes naturally to you, don't be so artificial. And since it's Indigenous Peoples Day, let's start with the thing that you pointed out about in the 60s, we had this belief that civilized people are artificial, but Indigenous people are primitive natural savages who are more in touch with nature than we are. Everybody said that in the 60s. I mean, it was everywhere, right? That was the core belief. And the farther back you go, the more you find that. Even during the Great Genocide, back in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries in the United States, the people advocating genocide said the same thing that the hippies would later say, which really should include the hippies in that it might have been bullshit. But this idea that, Indigenous people are less advanced than civilized people, that there is a great march of progress and it goes from the primitive to the advanced, and we're the advanced ones, and the people before us or whose land we want to take are more backward than we are. So because they're more backward, they have less right to it than we do because they don't know what to do with it, which, by the way, Thomas Jefferson actually said is an argument for taking the land from Indigenous people in the United States, because after all, they can't cultivate it correctly. They don't understand what land is for the way we do. Therefore, they don't have a right to own it. This was his argument.
That's what real estate developers, they make the same argument today.
They make the same argument. That's right. I know how to get the money out of that land, and you don't, so you really don't deserve to own it. I do, because I can get so much more money. So, built within this ideal is this deeply racist idea. And it's not just racist. That would be bad enough. More fundamentally, it reflects a profound misunderstanding of the way evolution works. Evolution, unlike the way that, racist people in the 18th and 19th century thought, is not a great march of progress. It doesn't go from the primitive to the advanced. It doesn't go from the worst to the best. None of that is true. There's been a counter-revolution in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and into the present in evolutionary sciences. Stephen Jay Gould was one of the people who made a huge impact on this, and his books are incredibly readable for anyone who hasn't read them. Yes. So I don't know if you guys have read any Stephen Jay Gould books of essays, but he does these essays that have names like The Flamingo Smile, or Incredible Life, or what have you, and they're all nice short little bits, and each one is an essay where he begins with some peculiarity of nature, like, why does a flamingo have that weird curved bill? What is the point of that? Or the panda's thumb is another one he looks at. It's like, what is the panda doing with that thumb? And he'll take it, the essay will end up taking you through some of the most fundamental ideas of our modern understanding of evolution in a really entertaining way, using this concrete, peculiar example. He's really quite good. I mean, he's one of my models for how to write. The use of a strange and interesting fact to set off an entire discussion. That's his gift. Well, he was the one that said our models for evolution are broken in several ways. He was a devoted Darwinist, but he said what we've built on top of Darwinism is broken in a couple of ways. One way is that the old idea that the way that new species arise is through a small, steady trickle of mutations, and over time, a fish becomes a human being. He said there's no evidence that's true at all. He and his partner developed the theory, his scientific partner developed the theory of punctuated evolution. And he said, if instead of looking for missing links you can't find, if you take the fossil record at face value and assume that it's not lying to you, then what it tells you is sometimes evolution changes species really quickly, and sometimes it changes them hardly at all. You could have a chambered nautilus swimming around the ocean today that's almost indistinguishable from a chambered nautilus hundreds of millions of years old. And you're like, under classical evolutionary theory, the slow trickle of mutations theory, what we said is it's a living fossil. For whatever reason, it didn't evolve. And Stephen Jay Gould and his co-author said that's not true. It did evolve. Its evolution was to fit itself ever more closely to an environment to which it was already very well adapted. The reason it looks very similar is because it got off to a good start in a stable environment, and it didn't need to change in order to fit itself to its environment. But less successful species, including species that are successful in one environment that then abruptly changes, must change more rapidly and dramatically in order to survive at all. That's not proof that they're evolving and the nautilus isn't. If anything, it's proof that the nautilus is succeeding and they're not. they're what they used to look like had to be discarded rapidly because it isn't working anymore. So, for any species, there's this start and stop quality to evolution. And that is the normal pace of evolution. It's not steady. It's not a steady set of trickles. That's not right. But if you're my age, we all grew up with the steady trickle of mutations theory. That was what we were taught. And anybody who has not grappled with the new evolutionary science still misinterprets the world according to a great march of small changes over time that lead from the primitive to the advanced. That was what we were taught. The other thing that goes with that, the second error, which is closely related to it, and I just alluded to it, is what's called the Great March of Progress. There is a famous mural that was painted to depict evolution, and I can't remember whether it was the Smithsonian Institute or where it was originally published. But once it was published, it was everywhere. Like, you can hardly get on the Facebook without seeing little memes of fishies and amphibians and reptiles, and they work their way up, and eventually they work their way through black people to white people because these things have their roots in 19th century racism, and they show the way that there is a steady march of progress from the slimy, old, bad, dark things to the new, advanced, white, good things. This is, you can see this is the era that still had industrialized slavery going, right? I mean, it's just all over these cartoons. And these days it's usually done as a joke. And after some kind of pinnacle of caveman in the peak of physical fitness, it usually then devolves to a golfer or someone looking at an iPhone or something else. To whatever political statement they want to make today. But all of these things are based on this idea that we had, that the purpose of evolution was to lead to us, because what could be better than us? And that we have all the virtues, we're good and advanced and blah, blah, blah. And our ancestors have all the vices. They were slow and stupid and cold-blooded and, dark-skinned and what have you. They would just scapegoat the past. Bye, Sharon. They would scapegoat the past. And put on a pedestal the present. So this idea that there is a great march of progress is still built right into our culture all over the place. Even when people are not drawing the cartoon of the Great March of Progress, just the way that they use words like primitive as the opposite of advanced, old as bad and good as new, which by the way is handy for marketers. There's a whole constellation of words and ideas and meanings that we think are separate and independent, but are actually still the leftover ideological fragments of the 19th century Great March of Progress. And one of those ideas, which was really popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries, goes as follows. Indigenous people are more like cavemen than we are. If we want to understand cavemen, we should look at indigenous people. Because as we know, we being racist 19th century industrialists, as we know, all those people whose land we're taking live primitive, backwards lives that must have been what it was like to be a caveman. So really, we've solved two problems at the same time. We no longer have to admit that we're largely ignorant of how our ancestors lived, because after all, let's just go look at these Navajo over here. And on the other hand, we can say, we can dismiss anything that indigenous people know as being foolish, because of course it must be like our ancestors, who by definition were primitive compared to us. You see, they reinforce each other in a little circular argument that doesn't actually bear any scrutiny at all. But as long as you don't think about it, it seems to explain why we deserve all the uranium and lithium and other natural resources, and none of them do. It all makes a very tidy explanation for why everything should be ours. So that was pretty much de rigueur. You can hardly read a 19th century book or early 20th century book on evolution or anthropology without them using terms like primitive, savage, backwards, or if they're going to say it in a more positive way, they'll say, preserve ancient ways of life, give us a lens into the past. They'll express it in these positive ways of imagine the discovery of our own history that can come from looking at these, savages in the Amazon. This is how they wrote, right? Typically. And I read every book I could get on evolution when I was a little boy. The very first part of my life in which I was a prodigy. In many ways I was not, and I was a very backwards kid, but one of the first ways in which I was a prodigy is I could not get enough about evolution. So I read everything. And they all said it, all of them. It was just a universal opinion. Bye, Geneva. See you next time. It was just a universal take. And what's fascinating is that even when the back to nature movement of the hippies was trying to praise indigenous people, they still praised them using the racist ideas and terminology from the 19th century and early 20th century. We praise them for their primitiveness. Primitive is good. Primitive means closer to nature. Nature is good. Ergo, indigenous people are good because they're backwards and primitive, like we wish we were. So that's the first part of my response to what you said, Donald, is trying to build. I know this is what you were leaning into, and I wanted to lean into it too, is this idea. Stephen Jay Gould and his partner said, this is hard for moderns to understand, but every species alive today is equally evolved. None of them is more evolved than the other. The whole notion that there is a ladder of evolution and we're at the top and slugs are at the bottom or some damn thing says that's all bullshit. Evolution and biology don't work that way. None of that has anything to do with science. That was all ideology, just reinterpreting evolution to please itself. If you see a great march of progress, if you see a ladder, if you see a tree with us at the top, those are all wrong. Evolution's, they make no bones about it. And he writes about it repeatedly in his essays. He says, none of that science. He says, science says the family tree is a great shrubby bush. It goes out in every direction. And all modern species are on the outside of the bush. All of them, no matter how primitive we think they are, no matter how much we think they're a living fossil or what have you. So yeah, Stephen Jay Gould, you totally want to read his books. His books are great. And you can jump in. It almost doesn't matter which one you pick up. I'm fond of The Mismeasure of Man, in which he talks about the evolution of Homo sapiens. That's a good one. But you can read any of the others. Flamingo's Smile, The Panda's Thumb, Wonderful Life. He's got bunches of them. So he said, evolution is a great bush. It goes out in every direction, and every species is equally evolved, equally advanced. And as a result, we've had to learn to shift our terminology. So rather than talking about less advanced and more advanced, we talk about more basal and more derived. And that has to do with how much have you changed from your ancestors. It doesn't say that changing a lot is a good thing, right? So if you've got characteristics that are closer to your distant ancestors, those are more basal characteristics. And if you've got characteristics that have changed a whole bunch, those are more derived, but derived isn't good and basal isn't bad, right? This is a big shift, and it's still happening. If you read science articles, you're still going to be confronted with these old ideas. So yeah, back to nature. So now the other part of what Donald said, and you're right, this is all very relevant to Kenneth Smith, because at the exact same time the hippies are saying back to the trees, here's Kenneth Smith saying, there's no back to the trees for us. We need our cultures. We have to have them. We are not like the other animals. We are not standing up on our feet and running around within 2 hours of being born. We are just not like that. And it's not even that, that'll be true in 4 months or 4 years. It takes us forever to develop into functioning adults. And that's not a defect in us. That's the whole point of us as a species. Our arete, our stupid pet trick, is that we are malleable, which requires us to be born unfinished. You can see why Pico della Mirandola's metaphor of Homo sapiens as unfinished, and that we need to finish ourselves, and that would be the great myth of modernity. You can see why that's attractive, because it's certainly true about any individual human being. You can't mistake it. Every single human being is born seriously unfinished. It takes an enormous amount of work to turn us into an adult. But the back to nature, the natural is good movements, so many good things came out of it, and so many bad things came out of it at the same time. We were taught that if you want to eat something, it must be because you have a nutritional deficiency and that food has the minerals or nutrients that you need, and so you must eat it. This was used as a justification for alcoholism. It was used as a justification for eating piles of junk food. After all, I want to eat the Twinkie. It must contain special nutrients that I am deficient in. You know what happens when you stuff your face with Twinkies for month after month. You do not become the height of health and nutrition. This is not the consequence. And, as I know, since all of my family members were alcoholics, you know what happens if you brew your own home beer and chug it down by the bushel load, every single day? Well, again, you don't become the most well-nourished person in the world. That's not the consequence. The whole idea that our desires are natural, and that natural is good inherently, leads into all kinds of problems. There were spin-offs into the child abuse and pedophilia movements in the 60s, some of which only became clear like in the 2000s. People did retrospectives and revealed certain famous science fiction authors, for example, were parts of, groups of pedophiles. And they used the back to nature, if it feels good, do it movement as their justification. All of this was part of this consequence. Rape culture, theft, all kinds of things. I think Kenneth is right, that Heraclitus is right, that just because you want something doesn't mean it's good for you or even good in general. You can't assume that because you want something it's wrong, but you can't assume that just because you want it it's right. We're back to Phil's equivocation. You have to treat all of these things intelligently, carefully, skeptically, but not cynically. It's the only way forward. And any strategy that they have in mind that fits on a bumper sticker, whether it's natural is good and primitive is good or what have you, it's it's a recipe for a banquet composed of nourishing foods and poisons side by side and mixed together. Topsy-turvy. So thank you for bringing that up, Donald. Near and dear to my heart, near and dear to my life. I had many over the decades, slowly, painfully, stupidly. I've had many of the consequences of that upbringing that I've had to root out and overcome in my own life. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, two quick comments before I get to my question I want to ask you. One is, Donald, you mean you don't believe in primal scream therapy? The other one is that, like,
I have the book though, Phil. I got it from my brother.
okay, Rick, like, you just presented a very interesting argument for Zeno's paradox about a nautilus.
Yes.
Once a nautilus gets a head start, Achilles can never catch up.
Right. The rest of us are failures evolutionarily.
So that's a very, very interesting argument. I'm surprised that it popped up this way, but nonetheless, that's why I saw.
Thank you, Phil. I think given how much moderns pat themselves on the head for how evolved they are, I think there's something to be said, even though it's still a distortion, there's something to be said for the reverse argument that very thing we're priding ourselves on, we should be ashamed of. It means our ancestors were incompetents. They had to abandon their earlier shapes and adopt new ones just to survive. We should be looking at the nautilus and saying, see, now that's evolution in action. That's a success. How long did we last? Well, not very long. We had to keep changing.
Okay, let me ask the original question. That's a pretty serious question.
Yeah.
There is no question that human beings are very dependent on culture.
Yes.
Whatever diversity it might be, because it sets the kind of almost ontological ground for our understanding of how to behave. However, I want to ask the next question as to what degree does culture depend on institutions that set the rules to the culture? Or is culture more free-flowing in terms of exchange of various things within culture between geist to form zeitgeist? I mean, like, that's an important question because it does seem that culture has become more and more reliant on institutions, which has its good parts, but also has its bad parts, because in some sense, it constrains the evolution of culture in a way by sort of consolidating it. It's not that it can't be changed. Like I said, I learned this when I visited India. That was like something like 30, 40 years ago. And, like, of course, the Indians sort of adapted the sort of bureaucracy of the British. Not that they're not in the bureaucracy already. So when you go and you want to register a complaint, you go to Department D because you thought that's the department that will handle it. They will, of course, say, no, that is actually Department G. Okay.
Yes.
So you run up to Department G and then say, no. You got this wrong. You got to go to Department A. And after a while, you're running around and you finally say, my complaint is actually not as important as I thought.
Seems less important to me now. I've blown 4 hours on
right.
it.
It's like
maybe I'm not so upset about this.
So the institution that is set up is essentially the deflect whatever it is, partly because they just don't want to pick up the responsibility to actually have to answer your question. But partly, I think that's institutionalized, right?
Yeah.
So I think that that question about the relationship of geist to zeitgeist and the relationship of zeitgeist to institutions,
yes,
and where institution almost seems necessary for nation states. How does that work? I mean, like,
so let's talk
not that I don't believe in institutions, by the way, because I actually do believe it is necessary. But on the one hand, it does become a problem. How does that wiggle room that allows it to evolve,
Yeah.
and in a good way?
Yeah.
I don't mean to evolve any old way too. So
Yes.
how does that work? So could you say something about that? Because that seemed like a very important part, because if we're going to exist in, what I term, and you sort of partly agree, or Hegel agree, in this floating world of culture,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Which really reminds me of Fellini's 8.5. Then I wonder, like, okay, the tether to the rope of 8.5. How important is that in terms of being the institution?
Yes.
Okay, that's my question, my serious question.
I am
So
happy
will you
to
say
answer
something
your
about that?
question. You bet. I'm going to start with the final sentence from that paragraph I posted, because it's necessary to what I'm going to say next. Kenneth says, human life and action can go errant incalculably many more ways than any animals, right? He says, we are thus liable not just to self-delusion, but also to the misdirection of others' malformed opinions and dogmatisms. That is to say, your confusion isn't, it's not enough that I confuse myself, but I can also be confused by your confusion. And, a wolf that's confused, the other wolves might look at it askance, but they don't all then subscribe to that confusion and all begin to behave in the same confused fashion. But people are wont to do that, right? We hear somebody else's distorting, confusing ideology, and next thing you know, we like it too, and we're saying it too. It spreads like a virus in us, and this leads us to issues around what you're talking about, culture. And does culture just develop on its own in a free-floating, organic way? Or is culture shaped and decided upon? And then what is the role of institutions in that? This is the question that you're putting your finger on, and it's right on the money. And I think the metaphor that we can bring to bear here is the same metaphor that Hegel has given us for the faculties of the mind, Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft. But in this case, applied a little differently. So the point of Begriff is that you are immersed in Begriff. The faculty of Begriff immerses us in the experience of life, so that we are very plugged in and connected to the moment, right? And the result of that is a 100% authentic life. It's as natural as a human being can get, but with a vulnerability towards parochialism and a tendency not to see where it's going. And so the more Begriff we live, the less we're able to explain how we got where we ended up. And we may have got there authentically. It might even be the right place to end up, but we didn't consciously do that. And we may find ourselves at a loss to explain how we got there. So it's got pros and cons, right? And the parochialism of it has the drawback that, there may be better solutions and we just never experienced them. So we never developed them. And they might even be the obvious solutions. The road we went down might have been a weird road that hardly anybody took. We just happened to be in the right place at the right time, that we didn't see all the other options. We only saw this one option, and that's where we went. So it can trap you. Parochialism can trap you in subpar solutions. But it has the advantage that because it is so close to nature, because it's so immersed in it, because that's the function of Begriff, it gives nature the maximal opportunity to beat the nonsense out of our heads and to make us harmonize with it. So after all, if we didn't, we died out. The ones that survive are the ones that are at least reasonably compatible with reality, however odd they may look. I suspect that for most of the 400,000 years our species has been around, give or take, they're still arguing over where the line is. That's how our cultures emerged, in that free-floating way. And I'm not saying nobody ever designed anything, but I'm saying that was probably the dominant mode, because it's the obvious mode. The obvious mode is I solve the day's problems in the way that seems the most obvious to solve, and the good solutions catch on and other people do them. That's right. I mean, That's the most obvious way to develop a culture. But there could be a Verstand approach. We've seen that. And a Verstand approach says, I'm not satisfied by the results of begriff approaches to culture building. I want to study the patterns of culture and the consequences of different choices, and I want to design a culture. And at first, probably all I want to do is design some change that I think we should do. We have lots of evidence of this in history. Almost all writing systems that we know about, you can put a name, even if we've got the wrong name, you can put a name on somebody who introduced it. And frequently the reason is it either all comes in or none of it comes in. It doesn't make sense if you only get the letter A and no other letters. Somebody said, you know what, I think I'm going to come up with this idea that we're going to have sounds represented by symbols, and I better represent most of the sounds we use in our language, because if we can't, I can't say the things I need to be able to say. So I either make the jump or I don't make the jump, which means that's not something you do by accident. The idea may have come about by accident through exposure, but somebody was, in most of the cases we know about for writing systems, somebody sat down and actually came up with a schema and then said, behold, the alphabet. And everyone said, huh. And had the usual varying reactions to innovation. There's a fair amount of evidence that this happens around language, that this happens around technological breakthroughs, that this happens around art. Certainly, if we look at the cave paintings, we have a long period of time where there doesn't seem to have been much. And when it first appears, it's pretty good all of a sudden. I mean, it's not that I haven't seen bad cave paintings, it's that bad cave paintings are often later ones, or even from the beginning, cave paintings are just like, you look at Lascaux and you're like, that is like art. I mean, that's amazing. So they didn't like start with stick figures and evolve their way up. Somebody innovated, right? And pushed that. Religions often have founders, right? We see from our own history. So there's a way in which Verstand approaches to culture and begriff approaches to culture can work together like this. But as Kenneth says, human life and action can go errant in incalculably many more ways than any animals. And one of them is, once we discovered the stupid pet trick of designing our own cultures, there's nothing to stop us from designing really stupid cultures, completely divorced from reality, or let's say increasingly divorced from reality, and whose purposes are not the purposes for which cultures were developed. As Donald will say, Kenneth has used the term anti-culture in some of his essays. And he says that we claim that we have a culture, but if you look at what a culture is supposed to do for Homo sapiens, and then you look at what our culture does for us, you have to conclude that it's an anti-culture. Most of its purposes are the opposite of the reasons that cultures developed among human beings. For example, we don't culture ourselves to survive better in nature, which is where most people lived for 400,000 years. We culture ourselves to survive better in the artificial environments that we create, that insulate us from nature. We don't use culture now to adapt ourselves to what's really happening in nature. We design culture to adapt ourselves to what's not happening there really at all, and is only happening in our artificial environments, like exchanging money for goods. I mean, it's not that animals never bartered or exchanged things, but this idea that everything should be calculable with a simple number, and that we should all spend our lives laboring to generate large numbers so that we can spend them on the things we need. No animal lives like this. This is totally not. This is not a thing. This is completely artificial, and many other parts of our culture are artificial. Especially considering that education, the point of education used to, let's just talk about No Child Left Behind and compare that to Paideia. The Greeks, as we see from these paragraphs, are saying that arete is the most important thing to focus on. Arete is the key to the whole game. And what you should be doing with each person is finding out what their natural gifts are and helping them to cultivate them to the maximum, so that together we have a rich armamentarium of, talents, gifts, and skills that we can use. But that's not what we do now with education. No Child Left Behind is based on the premise that we should all be identical, and that a single set of metrics should be applied to every child, that we should all read the same amount, we should write the same amount, our arithmetic should be the same amount, Our knowledge of civics should be the same amount, and we're going to standardize it. And every moment in the school is going to be focused on preparing for the tests that you have to pass in order to, have a life, basically, in the modern world. This is anti-arete. This is focusing away from anything that might be different or better in us, and focusing obsessively on pounding us in through the same holes, where there were square pegs or triangular pegs or whatever the hell we are.
A word from Schopenhauer.
Right.
Schopenhauer was the person who commented on education and threw rocks at Hegel.
Yes.
And so is there anything you could put there?
I need to read more Schopenhauer. I read him when I was a teenager. I haven't read him since, and I should. So when Donald says Rick has read everything, and I go like this, I'm not being humble. It's true. There's lots of things I haven't read.
Well, that was Schopenhauer's critique of Hegel. Schopenhauer he was a perpetual student. Hegel studied certain things. Schopenhauer was studying everything. He actually was a medical doctor theoretically. And he said to Hegel that you haven't studied the larger fields. You're just going in this direction. And that was his criticism, with a lot
sounds like a good one.
Personal envy.
Yes. I mean, I like that criticism of Hegel by Schopenhauer, because we know that Hegel really blew it when it came to Chinese writing. For example, he knew so little about Chinese writing, he thought the I Ching was the complete Chinese writing system. And he said, how could you possibly express philosophical ideas if all you have are these symbols from the I Ching? Ergo, Chinese people are incapable of philosophy, says Hegel, to which all of us now are just like shaking our heads going, you idiots.
Well, Schopenhauer noticed that the Orient was a lot bigger than they were imagining.
Yes. Yes.
But fortunately today we've finally regulated Schopenhauer to the wardrobe down in the corner of the room. We'll safely ignore him.
Yes, I'll have to remedy my adult deficiency in reading Schopenhauer. I enjoyed him as a teenager, but I like many of us, I no longer have 100% confidence in my adolescent conclusions about pretty much anything in life. That's why I need to revisit Schopenhauer. So anti-culture is something that the development of an anti-culture could only happen within a Verstand approach to culture building, in which you decide to take the reins and create culture for yourself. You could do it in a healthy way in which Verstand serves Begriff, or you can do it in a completely Verstand way in which you say, I don't care how the world or people are, I want to dictate how they should be. I think every person should be a number, and that is your current bank account balance. And I'm going to design everything, law and the economy, you name it, so that it all is driven by that balance. It's not just moderns who made this mistake. If you guys have never studied Anglo-Saxon England and how they did testimony in courts and determined who's right, it was also based on money. It's kind of hilarious. Everybody had an oath weight, which was their financial value within the society, and people with a higher oath weight, their testimony counted for more in court. And so if you could get more people to swear oaths along with you, then the oath weight for your side of the argument went up. That's really closely related to what we do now, actually, although we prefer not to make it quite so obvious. So that's the thing. This is, again, we're back to equivocation, Phil, right? I mean, cultures mostly develop the one way, but in recent years, we mostly develop them the other way. And there are consequences either way, whichever way you do it. And what we ought to have is a Vernunft approach to cultivating culture, in which there is a healthy dose of both Begriff and Verstand involved in the process. But alas, we don't have any Aristoi. Donald, and then Joseph, and then James. Go ahead, Donald.
Try to be quick. You keep kind of referring around, but this need we have for culture is closely tied to this biology, our characteristics as an organism. You've done everything, I think, but say it. When do our teeth come in? When do we learn to walk? the need for, well, I don't know how much culture if we're just individual families, but we need larger organizations, and we need them from the start. It's not something that just we're not making it here with the primal, the what do they call that in modern culture? It's our ideal, the core family,
Yes, the nuclear family.
The nuclear family, yeah. That's something that's only possible after we've gotten past all this. There are no primitive, you'd say that way, or ancient nuclear families. These things, they're so poorly adapted, they can't exist at that point. You have to have tribes or something, villages, extended families. It takes a large number of people to have enough hunters and gatherers and people taking care of children, or herders or farmers, however it's evolved. And the other thing I would say is, so culture starts immediately. Just like whenever our organism reached its modern state, we had culture. That's what I like. We need to find natural man before he had all this. Well,
yes.
Good luck.
Good luck indeed.
Yes. I don't think that's happening. It's like all these. I watch these shows, survivalists. Yes, they can survive as long as there was a steel mill over there, or whatever. They have to have so much. I don't think, but that's only a difference in degree compared to the real start. It's not a difference in kind.
That's right.
A culture capable of raising human beings from children is pretty complex day
Really
one,
complex.
because you got to do this for 10 or 12 years for everyone.
Yeah.
And then they just become young boys or girls that, okay, I think that's, I just say, and I know Kenneth thinks that it's all of these things, our virtues, our skills, our culture. That's why he makes these strong existential claims. We're existentialists because it depends particularly on what organism we are and what environment we're living in.
Yes.
Otherwise, we would be escapist.
Yes, that's right.
Or maybe we'd be Sardian existentialist.
Right. Well, we wouldn't be this kind.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you could see why other approaches to understanding the human condition catch on so much. They fit on bumper stickers better. This tradition of existentialist philosophy says that you don't really understand. I can't really understand Stephen unless I understand him as an individual, and as a member of his family, and as a member of his neighborhood, and as a member of his culture, and of the epoch, and of the species. And he has a character at each of those levels. And it's not the case that one of the levels is the true answer and the other levels are false answers. But almost all modern political, philosophical positions try to follow the law of the excluded middle and simplify the problem. They either say, man is exclusively a communal animal and nothing but a community, and the individual doesn't matter. Or they say man is an individual and the community doesn't matter. Only the individual matters. And both of these things are such zero-dimensional caricatures of the full complexity of the situation. It's when you start to look at how these kinds of gross oversimplifications spread like wildfire and become entire political movements in modernity, and you compare that to the ancient position that took for granted that it was complicated and paradoxical, right? The normal position in ancient Greece is that we're part of something very complicated and we have very complex relationships among each other. That's what even peasants thought, in ancient Greece. And yet moderns, even highly educated moderns, are still trying to reduce it down to either Ayn Rand is right, or I don't know who's the best advocate for only the community matters, but not the individual. But we hear it all the time, right? I mean, it's a very popular slogan. And you're like, if we're so sophisticated, how come our political and philosophical positions are so caricatures? The only way to understand modernity, honestly, has to be able to explain our lust for simplicity and caricatures. And if it can't explain that, then it doesn't have us figured out at all. So, how come I embrace complexity as a person has a lot to do with how much I embraced simplistic caricatures as a child and grew frustrated with them. Well, and as a teenager and in my 20s. I mean, I'm sure all over my belief system, I'm still riddled with these caricatures that I brought in before I became hostile to them. And, I'm still acting in my life in numerous ways according to these, law of the excluded middle caricatures. So the complexity of saying, who is Stephen? What is Stephen like? Is something that an ancient would take for granted, and a modern doesn't like the complexity of it. So, all right. So Joseph, and then James had his hand up, but put it down, but I might check in with him, and then Phil. So go ahead, Joseph.
I'll be very brief. So this idea that focusing on a system that could cultivate any, individual, so to speak. And I think about it, but the goal of the system seems to be off to begin with, like it's in education. And it seems to be based on just, and, I don't like to, kind of criticize any one philosophy, but something like a utilitarian approach, very utilitarian. In other words, we're going to just do the best we can under the conditions, so the greatest number for the greatest good idea. So this whole idea seems to be kind of flawed to me, and this is kind of what Kenneth is saying to me when I'm reading this particular section, is this idea that if you're applying numbers to something that's already kind of broken,
Going off the rails right at the
it's
beginning.
going off the rails. So this idea that you're then applying this logic to it is kind of irrational. And it's to quote Stephen's favorite word.
Yes.
So anyway, I mean, does that make sense in the sense, like, am I following correctly here? Not that I don't like to criticize one philosophy of life or at all, but it seems like that's where utilitarianism sometimes falls short.
Yeah, I'm sure Kenneth would agree with you. Kenneth has a great argument about utilitarianism. It's not so much an argument. He likes to quote other philosophers criticizing utilitarianism. Who was it who called the philosophy of cattle? The more we can all chew our cud, the better. But the argument I like to make against utilitarianism is Ursula Le Guin's story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which is, according to utilitarianism, if in order to make the most people the most happy, you had to torture the shit out of a small number of people, you must do it. You must hurt them as hard as it takes in order to make the rest of us happy, because the numbers say, big numbers good, small numbers bad. So in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, it's a short story about a paradise and everything is wonderful. And the only price is, in a small room, a child is being tortured forever. And, their pain is a small price to pay from a utilitarian perspective for everybody else's, happiness. And yet, as she says in the short story, and it's somewhere near the end where it says, and yet, despite how wonderful it is, there's always some people who walk away from Omelas once they learn how it all works. They're just not going to have it. And it's like, it's a mystery to everyone. Why? It's like, what? It's inexplicable. Why would you want anything less good than this? And the answer is because utilitarianism has this fatal flaw. It is, thinking about how to help lots of people is good. Thinking about how not to harm even small numbers of people is also good. but utilitarianism picks one exclusively. So, this issue of, producing people in a culture, what he's going to come to in chapter 4 is this issue that the ancients thought, which is if gifts are variably distributed, and if for any given circumstances or any given point in history, you don't know which gifts you're going to need, you can't afford to say, well, only 2% of us are artists, and life would be better if we just didn't worry about them and made everybody else happen. So let's screw the artists. Because if you did that, what if the thing that you need next year to survive is artists? But too bad, you stamped them out. There is this hubris in the idea that it's okay to trample a minority because we aren't going to need those guys. And the hubris is an assumption that we know what the future holds. Key to punctuated equilibrium and other modern forms of evolution is, and I've mentioned this before, is this understanding that the way evolution actually works is that no species is a monoculture. Every species is a diversity that always produces variance. And the variance might be in smaller numbers because they're not well suited to the current circumstances. But the circumstances are going to change, and we don't know what they're going to change to. And when they change, it's probably going to be some of those variants that thrive and the successful majority that fails because they're suited to the conditions that are gone now and that don't apply anymore. This support for not just a uniform model culture in the center, but for a whole range of possibilities is critical to long-term survival. And so cultures, likewise, if they develop organically in a begriff fashion, they survive in part because they leave room for the weirdos and innovators on the fringes of the culture. And the ones like Orthodox medievalism that try their hardest to stamp out all the heresies create a brittleness in themselves that sets themselves up for failure. Because as soon as conditions change, they don't have any answers for the new conditions. So yeah, the simple answers, whether it's utilitarianism or anything else, just going by the numbers alone, it grossly oversimplifies the real world and prepares us to misunderstand it. It's a challenge in science that, on the one hand, if you can develop an equation that holds true consistently, that's some pretty strong evidence you might actually have your hands on some natural principle. It's all, the acceleration of gravity, for example. That's a known number here on Earth. We know what that is. And it doesn't really matter where you go on Earth, you're pretty much going to get that number. It has a high predictive value, which is useful, which is why we love it. We love useful science that'll give us a mathematical equation. The problem is, and this will offend physicists and chemists and anybody else who's able to get simple numbers out of their science, but complex sciences don't break down to simple equations like that. Only simple sciences do. You start adding together enormous numbers of particles and you get chemistry, you start adding enormous numbers of chemicals together, you get organic chemistry, biochemistry. If you work your way up, you get farther and farther away from the realm in which simple arithmetic can model the world. And as a result, in these more complex sciences, we can't rely on numbers to be a complete representation of reality anymore. We need not just quantitative, but qualitative, and a higher variety of qualitative indicators to take the place of the missing numbers to try to make a science out of something. But as moderns, we're obsessed with numbers, so we resist that. And thus we hold ourselves back on the more complicated sciences. It's a problem. I mean, you put your finger on it. It's a problem. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a passing comment that I want to ask my other comment. Did the Greeks have any notion of utilitarianism in this sense? And I'm going to ask about Prometheus. Prometheus was suffering intensely because he was a god and his liver was continued to be devoured for a punishment for giving fire to mankind. And of course, because he can't die, he will suffer for eternity, right? That sounds like utilitarianism of some sort, right? Like somebody, in this case, in God, is going to suffer for our good. Thank you very much for the fire, Prometheus.
Yeah.
Sorry you have to suffer. I just wonder. I mean, that is a comment, so you could think about that.
Yeah.
The thing I was thinking about, that's a pretty serious question, is the difference between the Greek tragedies and the Shakespearean tragedies. I love both of them, so I'm not picking a preference. But the difference is interesting, because when I was younger, I was always bemiffed by the fact that, when the action's going, there's always this chorus in the background, just sort of like commenting, like, saying, what appeared to be nonsense, but it's warning, like, don't do this, like, it's just going to be trapped. Okay, so there was a relationship between the self, the individual, I could say, maybe not the self, the individual and the community. The community was always there, like, usually saying the opposite of what you want to hear. Okay, so that relationship was an intimate and complex relation that I think the Greeks never lost sight of, at least not the Greek tragedians. When you get to like Shakespeare, and particularly Hamlet, he's talking to himself. There are actors, but they don't have anything to say about it. He is talking between him, his outer self, and his inner self, right? Thinking, and through abstractions. In this case, the play is the thing to catch the conscience of the king. And he usually, his powerful things is not when he's in a dialogue with somebody else. You would say, oh, he's involved with some members of the community. No, it's when he comes out in a soliloquy. To be or not to be. Right. I mean, he's talking to himself. Yeah. I mean, like, that is modern. Like, yes. We are self-aware, self-conscious. We're wrapped within ourselves, with our own tragedy that we have trouble maybe getting in and out of. And that relationship between the self to the self and the self to the community, it's a very different relationship. I mean, I love both sets of dramas. I'm not putting down Shakespeare nor the Greeks, because I love them both. But nonetheless, that reflects a real different attitude.
Sure does.
To how we see things.
Yeah.
So that's a comment I want to make, that, and Shakespeare is great. So is Sophocles and Aeschylus. So I just thought I'd make that comment. And I think that reflects a kind of grounding that each culture is in.
That's right.
It's very, very different. That's
an excellent point. Yeah, you can learn a lot by comparing them. And if you then look for medieval tragedy, it gets interesting, because of course they want to believe everything is in the hands of their particular version of God, who is all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful, everywhere, and all good. And yet tragedy depends on the problem of evil, which presents a problem, right? They set up a contradiction for themselves in that particular structure, so that it almost starts to seem impious to imply that tragedies could just happen to people, because God has a plan, and it has to be a good plan and a perfect plan. There's no room for tragedy. There's only sin, right? It's bad things didn't happen because that would mean that God let them happen. He would never do that. It must be that good things were going to happen, and then you screwed it up because you're a bad person who needs to be punished in hell for all eternity. There is this there is this, when you go from the ancient world to the medieval world, tragedy just vanishes as an art form, and you get these morality plays instead that take their place. And then, of course, the rise of the romance, which again runs through the same idea of sinning and deviating from what you're supposed to do. And then along comes the Renaissance. And as soon as they're out from underneath the sort of genocidal orthodoxy and people can have freedom of conscience again and different conceptions of God, they're able to make room again for the concept of tragedy. But now it has this whole new character, as you point out in Shakespeare. Harold Bloom writes some interesting stuff about Shakespeare. But I think when it comes back to your earlier comment, I need to reread Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, which I haven't read in 35 years, I'm ashamed, to see what Aeschylus has to say about Prometheus's sacrifice. Can we infer what he thought about the suffering God, and whether that was okay or whether that was bad? And if it's bad, is he judging Zeus? What is Aeschylus's attitude towards Zeus's actions to be? I'd like a much clearer picture of that, because that would tell us something about your question that I can't currently say. I'd love to know. So thanks for bringing those up. I do love both kinds of tragedy too. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say my problem that's come up in recent years, and I might have expressed it before, that I feel like I'm on the Titanic. And I was content to be a nobody and sit down the end and twiddle my belly button and watch my soap operas. And I was happy there. But then I noticed the ship is sinking. So I went up to the captain's the bridge, saw the captain. I said, "Your ship is sinking." The captain said, "Oh my God, break out the brass band. This is what I'm seeing now." And it worries me.
Yes.
I still have those, well, at least two questions on the run. What is Gleipnir? I might warn you here, beware of being too abstract. Concrete versus abstract. My other question is the definition of rationality and what role does it play? So I still have those two grand questions. Nietzsche was one that did run along and said, "You guys have fallen asleep." There have been a few others in the early 20th century. So yeah, that disturbs me. I live in a world of disturbance because I notice the ship is sinking and there are more people than ever, but the average IQ has fallen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So I can't do justice to any of that other than to say, I'm glad you keep bringing these issues up. I'm glad they're recurring themes. We need to talk more about them. This whole book is about the answer to the question, what is rationality, among other things, because he's gonna suggest that it takes different forms in different epochs, even though it derives from the same fundamental capabilities. And I guess I'll wrap us up with one more fragment from chapter 4. The very next part of section D is a quote from Diogenes the Epicurean, which builds on what came before. "But now the most of men lie sick, as it were of a pestilence, in their false beliefs about the world, and the tale of them increases. For by imitation they take the disease from one another, like sheep." And this is that issue, right? That, it would be bad enough if we only confused ourselves, but somehow our confusion has an addictive quality. It has a transmittable quality, so that other people catch the confusion from us, and it spreads.
It's like modernity.
Yeah, right. Modernity might be the first epoch that wanted to spread. It considered it a virtue and a core founding principle that there should be nobody left. Everybody should be converted to moderns, and that it needn't be done in middle and late modernity. It takes the form that it needn't be done by imposition of force, if it can be done by catching the imagination, by just being desirable. Isn't that band great on the deck? Listen to how wonderful they are. You don't need to be thinking about that iceberg because, wow, listen to these players. There is this deliberately seductive quality that modernity cultivates in itself in an attempt to maximize its transmission. If it would only consistently try to impose itself by force, it would be so much easier to resist. But we take it in when we don't even notice that it's happening. So, all right, well, this is it for this week. And next week we'll continue with section D, but we made some good progress today. We are almost halfway through section D.
Yeah. It was by imitation. I learned English from my mother.
Right?
Imitation is the core of paideia that preserves our culture.
It is.
Sustains our civilization.
That's right.
And makes us sick.
Right, at the same time, the same faculty. It's like you can hardly get into any subject in human nature without a damn paradox. Two-edged swords wherever you look. Anyway, thanks everybody.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Great.
Phil.
Thank you,
Stephen.
everyone.
Thank you, Joseph.